welcome on Valentine's Day. Why don't we start with Commissioner Kavesi and just do very quick introductions around the room. Sorry, I know you're chewing, but...
Chuck Zoner, Planning Department.
Oh, I'm just an intern with the Attorney's Office.
A very important intern. Seriously, no.
Rachel Stahl, Board of Adjustment.
Martin Clark, Planning Commission.
Chris Rogers is doing it opposed.
Ellie Herbert with Planning Commission.
Ann Coyle, Planning Department.
Kay Qualley, Planning and Environmental Services Director.
Stephanie Nuttall, Assistant County Attorney.
Karen Sonneman, County Attorney.
Carly McGinty, Winona County Feedlot Officer.
Eric Johnson, Winona County Zoning Administrator.
All right. So we just did the introductions. This is what our Winona County Board looks like. More folks from the board will likely be joining us, but I think Commissioner Jacob might be on vacation. Can everybody hear me all right? Is this positioned correctly?
Yeah.
Good. Planning Commission members are listed there. Lynn Carlson, shout out. Patrick Byron, shout out as new members. Board of Adjustment, 5 members, only one of whom can reside in the city. The new chair is Cherie Hales, and she is also the liaison to the Planning Commission. Shout out to Rachel Stoll, Booth, and Wendy Larson, new members too. All right, the County Attorney's Office. Karen Sonneman and Assistant County Attorney Stephanie Nuttall, you just met briefly. We're teasing Stephanie by including this picture because she's always got her Apple computer with her, so my apologies, Stephanie. So I'm Kay Qualley, as I said. I'm going to do a very, very brief history of planning and zoning because the more important stuff is coming later, but this is still kind of important background. So what we do also, a lot of times you folks see us in relationship to variances, conditional use permits, and interim use permits. But we also do well in septic and feedlot work, the things on this list: development certificate issuance, water planning, recycling, county parks and trails, you may not know, energy saving, when we can find grants to help folks, low-income folks, and businesses reduce their energy footprint and save money at the same time. We love that. And Economic Development Authority is also in this department. What's planning? Creating a vision for the community today and what we want it to look like, keeping in mind land use planning involves rural areas, small towns, and medium-sized towns in our area. So we have a lot of balancing to do when we put together some of the official documents you'll hear about later. We also do kind of a systematic assessment of land and water potential, alternatives, and economic and social conditions. All that means is, because we don't have time to do a lot of societal assessments or anything like that, but we do periodically use the census data to find out where businesses are going, where industries are moving, where people are moving in and out of, to see if people are continuing to live and work in the county, if they're living here and working somewhere else, or if they're living somewhere else and working here, and how they spend their money too. So they're all kind of important things that you don't hear about quite as often. So we try to find the right balance when we're working with petitioners between new development, the zoning ordinance, and the comprehensive plan, environmental protection that the agencies talk to us about, and any kind of innovative change that can save money or energy, basically. In terms of planning and zoning history, Commissioner Ward has joined us. Your face was on the screen a few minutes ago, and now she's here in person. Welcome.
Snow again.
All right, we're going to talk faster then. So early planning and zoning was together with public health, and it grew out of public health crises starting about 1860, but really into the 1890s and 1920s. Due to overcrowding. And then planning and environmental and health diverged for many, many years, but now we're starting to work really more closely together for things like SHIP, state health improvement initiatives, more active living, transportation trails, like trying to have those things coalesce with each other. And I think that will make for better planning and for better public health. Planning and zoning history, the tenements, the tenement acts I just referred to. The City Beautiful movement did a lot of slum clearing and put up these architectural edifices instead of perhaps finding affordable housing for people. But there were some good outgrowths of the neoclassical style of the City Beautiful movement, and that was, it trickled down to city government buildings, public squares and parks and some statuary and things like that were kind of beneficial too. The plan of Chicago, Daniel Burnham was an early figure in making actual plans. So a 10-year plan turned into, in their case, a 60-year plan. Interestingly, the 2020 plan for Chicago, a lot of the grandchildren of the people that made this one were participants, but the public participation had changed dramatically to include people from all walks of lives, all parts of the city. So there was a dramatic change that way, which was a good thing. Teddy Roosevelt, New Nationalism, and the kind of the birth of the parks, the American Antiquities Act, and the protection of national monuments is also part of planning history. Zoning and trying to separate uses for public health started to come into real play in the early 19-teens. As evidenced by this slide, we've all seen maybe old pictures of this, or even some of the neighborhoods in Winona actually separating residential districts from commercial and industrial areas. Landmark legal case you're going to hear about later because we have legal eagles here, and you don't need me to tell you about this, but this is something to remember for later. And standard zoning enabling acts and the revised standard zoning enabling act started out in 1928. So we started moving into an era of, okay, let's kind of plan things out a little bit better for public health. When public participation is absent and one person has a lot of jobs and titles, like 12 in this case, Robert Moses, a lot of bridges, a lot of infrastructure got pushed through quickly. It's more the Chinese model of an autocracy. But some good things happened out of it too, but he was famous, but he was also infamous in a way too. Jane Jacobs was a reaction to that, and she was someone who wanted to promote everybody getting involved. And to me, all of you sitting here typify more of a Jane Jacobs model because you're all providing input and volunteerism for your community and your county. Big ideas, eyes on the street. When we got away from front porches and people kind of looking out for people and turned into cul-de-sacs, we didn't have as many eyes on the street, and it started to show in the way that neighborhoods were developing. So we're kind of going back sometimes to look at some of these folks that talked about keeping people in their homes, trails, walks, and doing as many things as we can to design things for all ages and all abilities. So that's a lot of text on that slide. Lou got sick tonight. I said, I'll do your slides, but I would never put that much text on. Comprehensive plan yields zoning ordinances, other plans that we have like the solid waste plan and the county water plan, emergency management plan are also all part of the planning and zoning department. All right, Stephanie, you're up.
Interrupted my cookie eating.
Middle one.
And my slides. Yep, we're good. I'm going to try to not overwhelm you with too much information, but I have two sections tonight. The first one we're going to talk about is basic land use law and legal authority and how we get to where we're at, where we're allowed to do the planning and zoning. And then after Eric's presentation, we'll come back and talk about what this looks like for you guys in actual practice. So we'll walk through from the point where an application is submitted to how you guys make your decisions as part of the Board of Adjustment, Planning Commission, or County Board. At any point, if you have questions, please ask them. I mean, you guys are here for 3 hours, so I'm guessing you don't want to just listen to us talk the whole time, and we want to make sure that your questions get answered while we do this. All right. The authority to engage in zoning starts with the Constitution of the United States. The U.S. Constitution has established the federal government, or with limited and expressly enumerated powers. What that means is that we as states, we as counties, we as anything can't do it without being told we're allowed to. They have granted what they call police power to the states. That's not what you think of. You know, when you think of police power, everybody thinks of martial law and the guys in the riot gear coming in to make sure everybody's doing what they tell them to. And that's not what that means. What it means is that we have the authority to put together laws and rules and regulations that protect the health, safety, and public welfare of our citizens. And in order to do that, we have the power to regulate land use through zoning. So our authority to engage in zoning, we have Euclid. Not really the mathematician. We're not going to talk about math. What we are going to talk about is Village of Euclid, which was in Ohio. And this is kind of where our zoning structure comes from. What they argued in this case, Ambler Realty argued that zoning was an unreasonable intrusion into property rights. How dare the state come in and say, you can't do this with your property, or you have to do things this way? What the Supreme Court held is that, no, actually, they can. It is a constitutional exercise of the police power that the government has a valid interest in maintaining the character of the neighborhoods and regulating where certain land uses should occur. They upheld what the Village of Euclid did as a means to protect the public health, safety, and welfare, the police powers that were granted. After that decision in 1926, we started seeing an explosion of zoning ordinances. Up until that time, there was a little here, a little there. All of a sudden, most local governments started putting together zoning ordinances, and now most jurisdictions do in fact have one. I think there's one major city in Texas, last I heard, that does not have a zoning ordinance, but that's a rare exception to this. Houston, yep. Houston, Texas does not have a zoning ordinance. So if you don't like zoning ordinances, consider moving to Houston. But what we get now is what they call Euclidean zoning, or dividing a land into districts. You get things like the single-use zoning, where one area has industrial, one area has commercial, one area has single-family. In some of the more populated areas, like major cities, you get the mixed use, where certain levels of buildings might have different zonings, things like that. The rest of it, after the Constitution gives us our police powers, comes from a wide variety of areas. So this list right here is why when you ask us legal questions, we say we'll get back to you, because we have to look at state statutes, we have to look at administrative rules and regulations, the state agencies, we have to look at our local ordinances, which, as those of you who are familiar know, is over 300 pages of a document. We have to look at case law, so we're doing legal research online or in the law library. We're looking at administrative decisions through the Attorney General's office or other agencies. There's a lot of areas where we can get the information about how we can and should proceed with this. But as always, the big one is the Constitution. And I picked out some of the major constitutional concepts that are terms we kind of throw around a lot, especially when it comes to our decision-making process. The first one's equal protection. The 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution provides that, among other things, a state can't deny a person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. And what that means for us is that we can't favor one group or another or impose hostile discrimination on any particular group. And what courts tend to look at is the reasonableness of classification. Is there a reason for treating one use, when it comes to land use, differently from another? And that goes back to our protecting the public health, safety, and welfare. Is there a reason why we're doing one thing here and one thing elsewhere? Due process. Due process also comes out of the 14th Amendment, which says no state shall make or enforce a law which shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or in what we do here with the planning department, or property without due process of law. And I know there's a lot of arguments to be made out there that anytime we're putting a restriction on property, we are depriving someone of their property rights. So that's what the 14th Amendment makes sure that we can't do without providing due process. It's also found in the 5th Amendment, which again says you can't deprive someone of property without due process of law. When we talk about due process, there's two different types, procedural and substantive. Hopefully we never have to actually dig into this other than on trainings like tonight. But procedural due process just means that the process and the procedures that we're following have to be fair. People have to be treated properly. We have to provide notice that something is taking place. We have to provide fair and public hearings, give people the opportunity to be heard. A lot of the things that we do during our meetings, so that public hearing component, how many of you never figured out why we do the calling 3 times for somebody to come to the podium and speak? It's to ensure that everybody that wants to speak has had their opportunity, making sure that it's called for. And that there's a record to support the decision, that the process and the procedures in arriving at a decision were fair to the applicant as well as to the community as a whole. Substantive due process means that our facts, findings, conditions, and decisions must be reasonable and not arbitrary and capricious. This one I might poke at you during Board of Adjustment and Planning Commission meetings, that if we're changing facts, if we're adding 2 things, there has to be a reason for it. There has to be a reasonable nexus to the stated objectives and criterias. There has to be something in the comp plan. There has to be something in our zoning ordinance that ties the facts to what you're deciding, because if there's not, we could have a constitutional issue. But in general, it's that reasonableness standard. We just want to make sure that they're, did this go away? Oh, nope, there it is. We just want to make sure that the decisions are based on the facts and that it's being applied properly in this particular circumstance. Back to the Fifth Amendment, and by the way, when I went to law school, I thought I needed to know the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments because I was just going to do criminal law. I had no idea that the Fifth Amendment also applied to property regulation. This was interesting discovery for me when I first started. So, the Fifth Amendment, yes?
Do you have a definition of fact?
What is presented in the record? So, the information before you, I think, would be the best way to do it. If there's information before you that can be applied to making your decision, that's what we are asking. What weight? Opinions are different. And we'll get to that when we talk about how do you make findings and what you should be considering and what you shouldn't be considering. But in general, if it's information in the record, it's up to you as a fact finder to decide how much weight to give anything. And what you should be doing is focusing on the actual factual information and applying that. Yes?
If there seems to be inadequate information or facts, do we request that there be more research for discussion?
It's always a possibility that you can ask for additional information if you think that that's appropriate. It's not recommended because we can run into 60-day timelines, which we'll also talk about later tonight. But when necessary, additional information can be obtained. So takings is the other piece of this that has come up a number of times when we're dealing with the land use things. Back to the Fifth Amendment, private property shall not be taken for public use without compensation. And there's 2 different ways that a taking can take place. The first one's physical invasion, and that's the one that everybody thinks of, where the government comes in and takes your property. So Uncle Sam reaches in, picks up your house, and says, "Mine now, not yours." With that, they have to provide you with appropriate compensation and go through the legal processes to be able to do that. There's also regulatory takings, and that's, how many of you have heard the term bundle of sticks when it comes to property rights? Anybody? I think I've talked about it before. But basically, when you own property, you have a lot of rights in that property, and we call that your bundle of sticks. And so what happens is with a regulatory taking is that when the regulations get to the point where you're essentially left with no sticks, where you have no rights, it's considered a regulatory taking because although we haven't come in and physically taken your property away from you, we've deprived you of everything that makes it useful. And so when that happens, it's also considered a taking and not a violation of constitutional rights, and you're entitled to be compensated for it. All right, nonconformities. Nonconformities are a legal use or structure that was in existence before the ordinance that if somebody wanted to do it now would not be allowed under the current ordinance. So it's something that was pre-existing. We've heard it called grandfathered in. So something that was going on and probably wouldn't be now, but we let them continue doing it because they have a constitutional right to do that. We are allowed to, under the law, classify, regulate, control, and reduce the number and extent of nonconformities. We are allowed to prohibit expansion of nonconformities. We are allowed to provide for eventual elimination and set timelines for that elimination. And those timelines have to be based on reasonable lifespan. There's some court cases out there that talk about if you are going to start doing those timelines, you have to jump through the hoops, figure out what's reasonable and when it would be realistic to actually have it gone. I've never actually seen one here. But what you can't do is just eliminate it. You can't just come in and say, you don't follow our current zoning ordinance and we don't care that you did before, you have to fix that right now. Nonconformities must be allowed to continue unless they are abated as a threat to health, safety, or welfare. There's a different process to do that. If you don't do it this way, it can be considered a taking. Yes.
Nonconformities transfer with the sale of property, or does that depend?
Probably depends. That's the good lawyer answer, is that it depends on whether or not it transfers with the owner. In general, I'd say most likely, because we can't. When we're talking about land use, we're talking about the use that it was being done, and we're talking about structures and things like that that are already there. So we can't make people go in and remove those for the most part. I think septic isn't right. When property transfers, don't they have to do something with septic? So I think that's one of the exceptions, but it's by statute. So. On top of all the legal issues that we have with the Constitution, the statutes, the ordinances, case law, everything else, we also have to deal with multiple areas of authority and jurisdiction. So we have the Constitution, the Minnesota State Constitution, Article 7, Section 3 allows for the creation of local government units known as LGUs. To those LGUs, the state of Minnesota has provided authority to zone to counties, cities, and townships. Sometimes those overlap. We have city zoning is generally, they zone all by themselves. Township zoning, on the other hand, can't be less restrictive than the county zoning. They can choose to do their own zoning, in which case they are responsible for it. Or they can agree to the county zoning and let the county control all the zoning for that. But if they do their own zoning, they cannot be less restrictive than the county. Okay. So I think Kay mentioned our local controls. Our local controls here in Winona County are the comprehensive plan. Minnesota statute 394.23 gives us the basis for establishing these local controls. And in order to have the zoning ordinance and maps, which is we are given the authority for in 394.25, we have to have a comprehensive plan. So we can't have the ordinances without the comp plan, because the comp plan and the map, or the ordinances and the maps, are based on the comprehensive plan. So the idea is that a comprehensive plan gives you the overarching goals, policies, this is what we want our county to be, and the ordinance and the maps implements that vision into actual rules and regulations. These items can, in fact, be amended. An amendment is taken care of through the provisions of the ordinance chapter 5.4. There's 3 different ways that it can be initiated. Either the county board can initiate an amendment, and by doing that they would say, we want to consider an amendment. They can spell out exactly what they're looking at. The planning commission could do the same. They can recommend an amendment, or a property owner can also seek to have it amended. There's an application process through the planning department. Regardless of how it starts, the planning commission is the one that first hears that. There's notice and a public hearing by the planning commission. They hear all the testimony, they do all those things, and then they make a recommendation and findings to the county board, suggesting what the county board can do. The county board might then hold an additional hearing if they want to, and make the decision about whether or not those official controls can and should be amended. And with that, on to Karin.
We're cruising. Yeah, we are. So, okay. Is that so?
Yeah. Little button changes the slide.
The little button.
Okay.
Well, welcome. Thanks for having us here tonight. And yeah, I'll watch the snow out the windows, gosh. So I'm here to talk about some of the things that lawyers are good at, is telling you what you can't and can do. So I would qualify my remarks, first of all, that if you have questions on anything, please contact our office. We're more than glad to talk with you about things. And the county's insurance, I'll call them carrier, but they're not really an insurance carrier. They always say, consult your county attorney for, they don't give you an answer, but they say consult your county attorney. So that's me. But so I'm going to talk about several different things that you need to know about as public officials, and you're all public officials here, serving in the capacities that you do. First, open meeting law, and make this work. Okay. The state of Minnesota, under the Minnesota statutes, says that all meetings of public bodies are open, but then there's always the exception. And it's the exceptions which really control the rule. But with limited exceptions, all meetings of public bodies must be open to the public. And this is because the public has a right to attend all open meetings, but the law is silent on whether the public may speak at any meeting. And it's really the duty or the job of the public body, and I'll take as an example the county board. When I became county attorney back in 2011, we worked on the rules of decorum, if you want to call it, and also how long would people, well, first of all, would people be able to speak at public meetings, and how long? And so came up with those rules to allow public comment at the beginning of the county board meeting, and a 2-minute limit, basically, but then that was subject to the discretion of the board. And what land use related governing bodies are subject to the open meeting law, as I've listed up there: state agencies, boards, commissions, departments. On the local level, the county board, all of the Board of Adjustment, the Planning Commission. Those are all subject to open meeting law. Now here's where the fun comes in with the law. What is a public body? Well, the law doesn't really define it. What is a public body? And so we've got case law that helps us at least interpret it. And one of the places to go also, if you're interested in doing your own kind of exploring, is to go to the Minnesota Data Practices Agency. It used to be called the Information Policy Analysis Division, or IPAD for short, not the Apple iPad. But they issue opinions. The Commissioner of Administration issues opinions when presented with questions of open meeting law, data practices, things like that. So technically, under the statute, there's no definition, but it's been broadly interpreted for public bodies as far as what they are. Now, there are exclusions, as it lists here, certain ad hoc advisory committees, and when there is less than a quorum of a public body that does not have decision-making powers. So that's one. And the purpose of open meeting law is to prohibit secret meetings. This is the Minnesota legislature established open meeting law. I'm not sure every state has it. And to have a specific agency in the state like we do, I think it's a good thing as far as making sure that the public has their right to be informed is carried out. And it also then allows the public to be present at open meetings. If you followed some of the, I think it's in Wisconsin, for instance, the legislature there doesn't follow open meeting law. They can convene secret meetings. The Minnesota Supreme Court also doesn't have to follow open meeting laws, things like that. So, but for our purposes tonight, each one of the bodies here, the County Board, Board of Adjustment, and Planning Commission are considered public bodies and must abide by open meeting law. So this starts getting really into, well, this is a very brief getting into the weeds of the law, but what is a meeting of a public body? And again, that's not defined by the open meeting law either. But there are a lot of case laws, and out of many of those come the quorum rule, that if you have a quorum, you have a meeting. And so it's best safe to publish notice of that meeting so that everybody knows that, in the case, for instance, of the county board, 3 of the 5 commissioners may be at a meeting. Whether or not it's a decision-making meeting or not, it's still considered a meeting. So it's just be cautious, basically. So it's a gathering of a quorum of the public body or a quorum of a committee or subcommittee. And it's for the purpose of transacting public business. Now, this comes up a lot, like, well, what if we're all at the same event at the high school? That's a social gathering, and so that's not covered under the open meeting law. So, or if you're in the same book club or something like that, or your kids are on the same sports team, that's not an open meeting. But I would just give you caution not to discuss items of business before the body, because then you can run into problems of, and we'll get to the slide in a minute here, serial meetings. So now we have electronic communication. When I started out in the, I'm old. Okay, I'll just say it. When I did my master's thesis, I used IBM punch cards to do my master's thesis. Who remembers IBM punch cards? All right, great. So we didn't have email. The internet was just an idea somewhere in one of the universities. So now we have to deal with, and it's a very serious problem, email meetings. Or over maybe Facebook, who knows what. You could come up with a lot of different things. So is an email meeting subject to the open meeting law? Well, again, the open meeting law is silent on the issue. And courts haven't decided that definitively. Now, what I can tell you is the legislature did start a data practices commission. And I would like to think data practices covers the broad open meeting law thing too, because again, the data practices agency covers open meeting law and data practices. And so that commission has been looking at all of the laws and trying to update those in terms of our new communication world. Now the Data Practices Agency has issued an advisory opinion to avoid discussion by email, and in fact found that the open meeting law was violated when a quorum of an advisory board commented and provided direct information and discussion on a matter relating to the board's official business via email, so be very cautious. One-way communication between a chair and members of the public body seems permissible if there is no discussion or decision-making. I would just, again, be cautious about communicating by email. So that gets us to serial meetings, which could happen via email. And again, this term, serial meetings, is also not discussed in the open meeting law. And courts have yet to definitively decide on the issue. But my interpretation is that serial meetings happen when, for instance, one board member emails another board member who then in turn emails another board member, and so you start having this round-robin communication of issues. So again, avoid having conversations where you're talking about the same thing, and particularly talking about, well, how should we decide on that issue? No, you don't want to do that. So, all right, here's a subject that always comes up: what meetings may be closed, and as related to land use related matters, certain property transactions, negotiations, things like that in terms of asking price for property, review of confidential appraisals, and developing offers and counteroffers. There's also certain security matters. And in economic development, there are specific, there's specific statutes that talk about how to deal with confidential business information. And as it says here, projects not yet receiving a public benefit, there is a specific statute. And again, because we don't want to, we want to keep going, right, Kate? Okay. But I have till 5:50, right? Okay.
Stephanie will have to speed talk at the end, though.
Okay. All right. So again, this is, I mean, they print a book out of the data practice and open meeting law. So if you do have questions, please give us a call. So I'm just going to go quick through these. What other meetings may be closed? There are statutes that say expressly what can and can't be closed. Now we can get into data practices, which I've been instructed not to talk about in great detail. So, and I won't, because again, that one is even more fun in terms of figuring it out. And again, I just would ask you to give us a call, and if you have a question about a data practices. But data practices law, kind of like open meeting, is the premise of data practices is that everything that any government entity collects in terms of information is available to be then disclosed if it's requested by somebody making a request. However, there are exceptions. So, and it's those kind of exceptions that make it very prickly to try to figure that out. So I'm going to pass through these. Yeah. Well, that's the premise of, but there are exceptions. So that anything that's collected by the government, say if somebody sends in an application for some, like the EDA, okay, or excuse me, the Economic Development Authority, that a business is looking for a loan. That is subject to the data practices law that says, well, on the face of it, everything would be available if by request. But there are exceptions, and they are numerous, and they work really to limit the disclosure, but for good reasons, because there's certain information that any government body it can also get in trouble for disclosing confidential information. But, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So most of the data that any sort of land use issue that concerns any land use issue that does not have to do with the price of the property and those three things about pricing of property.
That was for the open meeting law, but yeah.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, but anything that you would deal with in terms of land use should be considered public data.
Not necessarily.
And in what circumstances would it not?
I'm going to give you a good lawyer answer in that I'd have to see the specifics of what the request is, because again, there are a lot of exceptions to the data practices law, and they're getting more specific. In fact, we've added to the county data practices policy because the statute did change a couple of years ago about being more protective of confidential data or non-public data or private data. So unless it falls under the exceptions, yes, it can be released, but it has to be reviewed to make sure that the public body or the government agency is not releasing information that might be of a confidential or non-public or private data. So because there are consequences for that. So just have to be careful.
Yeah, a couple of land use ones that I know I've recalled is proprietary information where it was actually, if it was disclosed, it might compromise the nature of the businesses themselves. Anything regarding healthcare, we get into some of these CUPs or IUPs now for healthcare reasons. We're typically not supposed to disclose what the specific medical or doctoring or any of that. That's all protected to some nature. So some information has to be screened. Anything financial, account numbers, social security numbers, all that stuff is typically taboo, not to put it out there for dissemination for the public.
A couple other ones that I'm aware of would include the name and identification information for somebody making a land use complaint. That's and investigative data. So if there's an investigation into something civil or even criminal, because our zoning ordinance makes violations a criminal offense, you can be cited for it. Active investigations, that data has some levels of protection as well.
Yeah, point taken. But when that investigation is complete,
Then it becomes inactive and different rules apply.
doesn't it become public?
Not
Different
not
rules apply.
necessarily.
It's not always.
Okay.
It depends.
There's certain information in both civil and criminal investigations that can never be released. So, well, my office actually has the authority to release certain information if I feel that it would be in the public interest, but not harming the interest of the person of, the subject of the data. So it can be really tricky. So there's no, easy yes or no answer. So yeah. Okay. All right. So these are just some slides, and you've got it in your materials, so you can read that about what government data is and what we do with it, and we just kind of talked about that. So I want to get into conflict of interest, and this is brief too, because I've provided over here, if you haven't grabbed them yet, handouts on open meeting law, a handout on what I'm going to get into right after conflict of interest, and a very long but very good discussion of conflict of interest by the Minnesota League of Cities, which does apply to the public bodies here in the county as well. So we'll get into conflict of interest really quick here. But basically, the law is that public officials have to disclose potential conflicts. And public officials is defined in the statute, and they just recently, a couple of years ago, added county commissioners to that public disclosure definition of public officials. So I leave you just with, read the memo on the League of Minnesota Cities. Okay? And if you have any questions, please call me about that. Now, the last thing I want to get into, and I've provided both a memo that I've updated for the purposes of this meeting or this training, as well as an attachment that I've used and still good because MCIT still uses it, about quasi-judicial roles and quasi-legislative decision-making. And I know Stephanie's going to talk a little more about this too, I think, in some of your things. So I would commend to your reading the memo that I wrote, the applicable MCIT publication, and it really comes down to which hat are you wearing when you are making a decision as in your role as either Board of Adjustment or Planning Commission or County Board. What kind of decision are you making? Is it quasi-judicial or is it quasi-legislative? So what are those two? Quasi-judicial is a decision that you're making based on applying the record before you to an established policy that can include but are not limited to the county zoning ordinance and the comprehensive plan, the official controls. And these were policies established by the county board exercising its legislative decision-making powers in creating the comprehensive plan, in creating the county zoning ordinance. So legislative decisions establish policies for future application. Quasi-judicial decisions apply facts, the record, and the record's important. I think Stephanie's going to talk about that. That the record is applied to those established policies to make a quasi-judicial decision. So, like I said, read the memo, ask me questions, but always when you're sitting down and thinking, okay, what is before me, and what kind of decision am I making? And a lot of this, this kind of came to the forefront in 2011 when a Minneapolis City Council person was a very active community leader on zoning issues and was fighting against a developer wanting to put up a very tall tower in Loring Park in Minneapolis, if anybody's ever been there, to know what that looks like. And she was very active and was actually organizing opposition to it while she was sitting on the city council. And when the vote came, there was then, I believe the developer lost the ability to build that, and he sued, and the Court of Appeals held that council person shouldn't have been involved in that decision, should have recused herself. And so it went back to decision to the city council to be redecided. And that, like I said, came out in about 2011. So there was quite a bit of press about that. And that decision is also discussed in the MCIT publication that I've given you. So it really is about thinking about what kind of decision are you making, what kind of hat are you wearing. Yeah, Kelly.
I thought I remembered Jay Squire citing that, I don't remember if it was during our training a year or two ago, or when it was some other context I heard him speak, but I thought I remembered him saying that the planning commission is quasi-legislative and the board of adjustment and the county board are quasi-judicial. They're the only two quasi-judicial organizations in planning.
Well, and the planning commission actually makes recommendations. It doesn't make actual decisions in the sense. But I just throw it out there as a caution to be careful. But you're right. The Board of Adjustment is looking at, for things like variances and looking at what is the ordinance? What does the ordinance say? What does the comprehensive plan say? As well as the county board too. So, but it really is that case is a really good lesson in kind of considering, because once you become a public official, unless you're in the legislature, okay, it's kind of difficult to be. I mean, not that I want to quell or say, you can't be an active person about issues you believe in, but you have to be cautious, because you're going to be making decisions about things that come before you, and it has to be based on the record, which Stephanie's going to get into a little more on that. So remember which hat you're wearing, and anybody a student of World War II history? I think we're all too young to have gone through World War II, but I love this poster. I love World War II history, but it was up, loose lips might sink ships, so I apply that to quasi-judicial versus quasi-legislative decision-making. Just kind of remember that you have to be cautious in your discussions on quasi-judicial before the record comes before you. So with that, I will, and gee, I'm right on time. Am I? I just started when I was supposed, I ended when I was supposed to start.
And I went short, yeah.
Okay.
Do you want to take a break now, or do you want to do Eric's portion and then take a break before mine?
Yeah, maybe do Eric now, if that's all right with everybody, if you're good with not out taking a break right now.
Yeah, if everybody knows where the bathrooms are, if they have to run out, that's fine, but
And also, there's more sandwiches inside for a couple people that weren't able to get in, so if you're still hungry, please, we don't need them here. So, go for it. Make some space.
Okay, for those who haven't formally met me, I'm Eric Johnson. I've been with the department about 26 years. I'm just going to touch on a little bit of the history, a little bit of the official controls that we have in our department. First thing I want to, show is the zoning ordinance. A little bit of history in Winona County. In 1968, we adopted a interim zoning ordinance. At that point, it was a very much a boilerplate or template that was given to most of the counties in the state of Minnesota, or maybe in the Midwest for that matter. So essentially everybody started out with a pretty close to same or similar zoning ordinance across the state for the counties that wanted to get into land use. Moving forward, it wasn't until 1970 where we adopted the regular zoning ordinance. That served us for roughly 18, 19 years. Second generation of zoning ordinance took place in the late 80s. A lot of the discussion at that point took into account the new floodplain, higher accurate data. A zoning ordinance is a living, breathing document that is always changing. It's continually being amended due to changes, due to the comprehensive plan that we have, due to needs and growth and wishes and desires by the townships and the cities that are within our county line. In the 80s also, we entered into the Ag Preserve program, which was a tax break or credit given to people that wanted to enroll acreages by voluntarily putting a covenant on their property that said they were not interested in annexing or developing their property. At that time, the lure was $1.50 per acre per year. There's still a good share of those folks that do keep their farms in that program. But part of that requirement was in the late 80s is where you started to see density controls in your agricultural districts that tried to limit non-farm growth or sprawl out of your better agricultural lands. By having, we adopted a 1 per 40, one non-farm dwelling per quarter section, and that was enough to satisfy that. If anybody's interested in that program, it's Minnesota Statutes 40A that lay out the framework for that. There's only roughly 4 counties in the state of Minnesota that have that, and Winona County is one of those. It's not very actively seen or sought out at this point in time. Most of our enrollees took place in the early 90s with that program. Also in the late 80s, we kind of changed our zoning ordinance. Zoning ordinance is an official control, which I think we'll get into a little bit too, as well as our comprehensive plan and land use map. I'm going to pass this around because in 2014 we did amend our comprehensive plan, and essentially we carried over the comprehensive plan that was done in the late 90s. So essentially this is kind of what the county is for projected long-term future growth. And those areas that are highlighted in the red and blue, they kind of show to recognize where areas of growth have historically occurred and where areas from a geographical standpoint have been selected as perhaps the best areas for growth to occur. The 1980 generation ordinance seen many changes. We got into things such as adult entertainment and advertising devices, and as needs changed, so did demands and inquiries and permits that we issued. We entered into feedlot permitting and regulation. I believe in 1995, we had a series of amendments through 96 that changed and amended some of the standards as far as our feedlot inspection and feedlot permitting programs. On here a little bit. 2011 was the major amendment to the zoning ordinance. We changed multiple sections, kept a lot of the baseline of the document in its form, and changed slightly some of the zoning districts to take into account some of the natural resources and some of the bluff requirements and resources like that. The comprehensive plan, I won't read this verbatim. Essentially, it's the guide book that lays out the typical use, and it gets into topic specifics, mainly like in what are the goals for industrial, what are the goals for commercial, what are the goals for residential, our natural resources, economic development, and it also then takes into account for demographics. Like housing studies, where are we growing, where are we inadequate as far as serving the needs of the people in this county and in the cities that are within our boundaries. That is also an official control, the map I'm passing around, the comprehensive land use classification map, the zoning ordinance is one, the zoning map, the official map that recognizes the boundaries in which district you're in, that is an official control. And the next diagram essentially shows that everything around it evolves around the comprehensive plan. Everything that you do, resource protection, your permitting, what are the values, what are the goals, what are the action items, all those things kind of should reflect your official controls that you have, county. The zoning map, separate than the comprehensive land use map, but the green is your agricultural resource conservation district. You can see well over 90% of the county is zoned in that district. The pockets of brown is what you call the rural heritage. They're, for all practical purposes, they're the agricultural district as well. It's just recognizing that there are structures and uses that have been built on those parcels, and they're afforded some type of grandfathering clauses, which applies to their specific building sites. You can see we do have some residential areas. We have some very little industrial areas, because most of those districts you are going to see them being located within a municipality due to their needs of requiring sewer and water. Each zoning district and zoning ordinance is laid out as far as what the performance standards are. Those would create what the setbacks are, what the minimum lot sizes are, everything from you get into other areas other than agricultural, like your commercial and recreation, or commercial and industrial. It calls for fencing, screening, landscaping, parking, lighting. Those are all items that are laid out as far as performance standards. And also there's another slide coming up, but within your zoning ordinance you're going to have a list of what's permitted. That means they can, in some cases, do it without asking for permission, or if it's a permitted use that requires a permit, they need to apply for an administrative permit, which if it meets the guidelines, we can issue that. Conditional or interim means something that is probably a little bit more suspect to having an impact, therefore it needs to go through a public review process, like a conditional use or interim use, or in some cases a variance if they can't meet the specific standard, and then prohibited uses, which mean they're not eligible to apply for. And I think I just kind of went over those items, and there's a sheet that kind of explains each of those. Within a zoning district, and also within our zoning ordinance, we'll talk about underlying districts or overlay districts. Those could be shoreland, they could be floodplain, they could be archaeological, historic areas, they could be a few other things. One example, I want to show that this is a property in the agricultural district, and this proposal showing that they want to split off, let's just say a 5-acre parcel. So we go to our zoning ordinance, we see 40 acres is the minimum for permitted, but they can select anything down to 1 acre. But under that projected proposal, that would have to be reviewed under a public review process as a conditional use permit. Because 2011, that was how we were going to review and permit non-farm building sites moving forward. Also, you see it's kind of in a shaded area. So in this example, if the building or structure or activity is going to take place in that it's supposed to represent 300 feet on perhaps each side of a creek. And you can see that that structure would be within that. That's an overlay district. Therefore, it also require a conditional use permit. So in this case, if they were to build a house, they'd actually need a conditional use permit for two specific categories of the zoning ordinance. One, because it's less than 40, and one, because it's in the shoreland district. We'd still have to look at setbacks, and as long as they met a 100-foot setback from the stream and met property line setbacks, and the slope and steepness and bluff requirements are met, it would still be an allowable use as a conditional use permit. No variance is required with this example. Okay, let's see. And shoreland permitting, this just talks about additional things that the department and staff have to look at with each proposal. Slope is a big one, bluff requirements. We get into things as far as requiring riparian protection that would not lead to excessive erosion or runoff into the water body. It's basically taking the DNR model ordinance. They create the baseline, and we have to enforce that at a county level. This shows all the entities that we do have some involvement with, as would like the city of Winona and or Wilson Township, which is a township that administers their own zoning. But the hierarchy of this is that we'd have state agency oversight from Minnesota Board of Soil and Water Resources, which is Bowser, Minnesota DNR, MPCA, which they receive their mandates from the federal government, everything from the EPA to USDA to FSA, Corps of Engineers. A couple examples, and also there's requirements as far as program, even though they might not be building something as far as earth moving may get involved into shoreland programs, the Wetland Conservation Act, and also MPCA requirements. So that is considered a development as far as land alterations, and these are kind of the, some of the specific Minnesota state rules that govern some of our program requirements. So you can see, even though we have our zoning ordinance, we have other volumes of regulations that we have to cross-reference with everything that we do. Okay, just wanted to quickly go over what do we do. Do we just entertain the Planning Commission and Board of Adjustment with variances and CUPs? Well, I'll just go over a quick few numbers of 2018. For last year, it looks like we had 10 conditional use permits, 12 variances that you boards were involved with. As far as administratively, what you wouldn't see is we had roughly 130 development certificates or permits, everything for construction. I believe, looking at the numbers, we had 26 new homes, and that could be replacement homes or that could be secondary homes that were added to farms under conditional use permits or qualifying farm dwellings. So that's a healthy number. I mean, numbers have been going up the last 5 years as far as new residential. We get requests for that information quite a bit. The median house value was $172,000 of the permits that I reviewed. So that was the baseline. We issued 3 land disturbances permits for land alterations, 8 timber harvesting. We issued 91 septic permits. We reviewed 77 septic inspections and conducted new installation inspections. That would be 77. We also received 80 inspections of existing septic systems from the private sector. That all translates to the point of sale process. That means if a property is sold in this county, irregardless if you're in a city, it's still governed by Winona County. We had 101 transactions of properties that had septic systems where our department was reviewed those point of sales. We had roughly 25 to 30 complaints alleging certain violations, and altogether the permits that we issued for new construction was roughly $12.5 million of value of structures that were built just in the township areas. That's nothing to do with the municipal limits. There's 35 agricultural permits that we reviewed for barns, ag buildings, those type of things. We had 19 solar applications. That's a number that continues to go up every year in the last 4 or 5 years. We had 14 permits that we reviewed that were in the shoreland district where we had to impose additional standards.
How big a solar panel array can you put up without having to get a CUP?
Basically, I believe we want to say 40 kilowatts, I think, or over an acre. Most of the, I mean, it's real easy. We haven't had any that have, it's either been for their personal use, either residential or agricultural, but if it's a so-called solar farm, most of those that we're seeing have been a 3rd megawatt up to 5 megawatts. So it doesn't seem like there's many in between. It's been a real clear case for us to review those on how they would be permitted. There's 8 wetland permits that we reviewed, and at least 25 or 35, between 25 and 35 interactions with farmers and agricultural people wishing to do certain projects to make sure they were in compliance with the Wetland Conservation Act. And a lot of that work, most of our programs are talking about township, but there's also programs that we have where we have a relationship with the city of Winona and other cities in which we are the LGU, especially when it comes to wetlands. The city of Winona does have contact with us as well as Lewiston to be involved with some of the permitting, so we almost take a joint approach when it comes to those things, so there is a strong city involvement. Next, just quickly wanted to go over a development certificate. We don't call it a building permit, essentially because that would imply that there's building code inspection. Winona County is a non-enforced county as far as the building code. If you are going to issue building permits, that implies you are going to have building inspectors, and you are going to require permits from everything from putting in a kitchen sink to new fixtures in your house. We do not do that at this point. The requirement is as if they're going to have a contractor that they have a Minnesota builder's license that goes along with that application. Our process for a development certificate is really a 4 or 5 step process. The first is that the applicant submits a site plan and application. So we're reviewing it with all those standards as far as the zoning ordinance. Second step is we'd inspect the site. They would typically stake it out, and we would conduct an on-site inspection. And what we're really trying to do is verify the use, because even though something's constructed, there is sometimes some variable degrees as far as how it's going to be used, which would have different implications in the zoning ordinance on how that may or may not be permitted. After that, the permit is issued. The last step, however, is called the certificate of compliance. There is a requirement for every building applicant to let us know when they are complete with their project. We then do a follow-up inspection to verify that the structure was built in the location that was applied for, to the size that was applied for, and finally being used accordingly to the way that they indicated. Example. Here's a good example. Here looks like a metal pole building built somewhere. Could it be accessory structure? Could it be a primary use? Could it be an agricultural use? just by looking at a picture like this, you may not be able to make that determination until you have adequate information. We're seeing structures like this that could technically be lived in. The term that they're using is a schouse. It's kind of halfway between a shed and a house. But, we see there's different lifestyles and different, it's a phenomenon that you see statewide, But we'd have to verify the use because, if there's going to be plumbing, there's going to be wastewater, those are all other elements of that proposal or that development that needs to be addressed. If we just look at this picture, you could also see there could be, luckily this isn't from Winona County, so I can pick on it a little bit. To me, it looks like there could be some areas here that are indicative of wetland, so that could be a red flag. If it's floodplain, that could be an issue. So those are all the things that we would, as staff, have to review at face value with any type of structure. Our zoning ordinance does require permits for agricultural structures. There's no permit fee for those, but we still want to verify that they're not going to run into problems when it comes to setbacks, too close to a property line, too close to a road, being in a floodplain, running afoul of other requirements. Okay. And then, typical compliance issues are some of the things I just mentioned. If you're a neighbor, you're seeing something, we get phone calls on a pretty regular basis that are fact-checking, double-checking, just to see what it is. The typical one that we see is junk properties. Those are probably the toughest to actually deal with, too, from a standpoint of doing it, because most of them are just accumulation, the hoarding. Most of the farms, growing up on a farm, I knew there was vehicles and equipment that you'd always cannibalize for other vehicles, and they weren't being used, but they served a purpose. Were you engaging in scrap metal collecting and for a business? No, it's just there's a practical use for everything, and that seems to be a rampant sentiment of a lot of the property owners that are out there too. So. But septics, anything that could be overflowing or runoff, then you got a health hazard. There's Public Health Act statutes that govern those situations. Grading and filling activities can get somebody in hot water too, as far as some of these other, the state programs that they have with the wetlands, property line disputes. Those are probably some of the more frequent complaints that we get in our department. And talking about complaints, we talked a little bit about the privacy data requirements, things to that nature. And so basically, after we get those information, staff is tasked with bringing a request to one of your boards when it gets to the point where it's beyond a staff determination. A variance, a conditional use permit. We also do, the Planning Commission could see subdivision plats. You could see rezoning amendments, and we do amend our zoning ordinance certain sections periodically from time to time. But I guess I just want to leave, staff spends a considerable amount of time with the people that inquire in our office, trying to get them to the point where they do not need a variance. That should be the goal, is that they comply to the best of their ability without running afoul where they run into a variance request. So we screen out, or we try to work with a lot of applicants. That's basically our standing mission as a department. And I think that is about all I have, because that kind of gets into Stephanie's last presentation.
I think we'll take our 10-minute break now, and then we'll come back and start working through our process.
More box lunches, or you can just steal the cookies out of them, or in the other room.
for the sandwiches. Some of us don't have a sweet tooth.
Really?
I know, if I eat a store-bought cookie, which I just did, I'm usually sorry because it's not worth the calories. But I kind of felt like a little something.
Well, they do actually. Are they chocolate chip?
Yeah.
Okay, they're good. Yeah.
Like your chocolates, the ones I for myself, and I'll eat one or two.
We'll have to check.
He's like, how do you do that? He's also there and I don't know.
Seriously, yeah, it's good.
I make no promises about the second half.
Just, you know,
It's okay.
move it.
Shoot is silent, narrate what you're looking at. Did too much ad lib. Time wise, I think I nailed it.
No, I don't have.
Good job. There's an inside joke here. Were you the rose giver? That was from you? Golly, big softy. Well, that was nice.
Hey, Ann. I just said, hey, Ann.
He's good, I think.
That's whatever.
Eric, long time no see. You been behaving yourself?
Back to this, and of course, now when, we had one, I know years ago where we had, Kelly both spoke against, and that was.
Oh, I don't know.
The way I interpret it, and I'm no attorney, although sometimes I think you should be. Type question, but, you're a citizen of Winona County, and so if you're not on the planning commission, you should, it's a public, open meeting. You should be able to state your opinion without somebody challenging you as to whether you can have an opinion or not.
We don't get opinions anymore.
Are they? Yeah. Now, when did you join the press corps?
Fresh Corps?
Yeah.
Well, I was a
Chris
young guy.
Out.
I was a
Well, see, that's the thing our people don't realize.
Last I saw her, she was
We, even all these lawyers we got running around, we do the business. Everything is political. There's a piece of Supreme Court that makes it nominate. Damn thing to do with their qualifications. Just have, whether you were considered a liberal or a conservative. And there's some room for that. But, it would be kind of nice if we could get some of the qualifications. I don't know. I don't think anymore that we're trying to do that. One of the reasons for that is with the iPad issue where the when it's got, you can make a case for anything. And there's once you make your case, put it on the internet. There's basically no way that it can be authenticated, fact checked, and so there's a lot of people out there that have a lot of opinions that are totally false. I have a son that's a millennial, and he stated to me that between 25 and 100% of the millennials, maybe in the whole world, and there's those that are promoting that idea, doing it in their life, because they got these chat rooms. It costs money to be in a chat room, so they just take these people's money by arguing with them, and a lot of them believe them. And, you know, I can't see that. That's what would be the word?
So, hello, I'm Patty.
Positive.
Good to meet you. And what are you doing?
So I'm an intern at the attorney's office, so
Nothing
we do
worse
a lot of
than
different stuff, open hour,
my opinion,
stuff like
than
that.
a lot of the press.
Pretty good. Not so much there, but I do have
Don't
like
report news
internship
anymore. They
immigration class
report
where I have to do some research that
what they want to try and convince you to feel that their opinion
yeah,
is
there's
right.
a lot of new stuff. I mean, we talk about criminal justice, it's like criminal law. So side of it is pretty tricky. Yeah.
All right, should I gather the troops? Sooner we get out of here.
It's true.
Seriously, you're not going to talk to me.
I like to keep things short, sweet, and to the point. Get the important information out, and get everybody out of here.
Really don't question it. God bless us for your wife.
I'm pretty well. Yeah. And my part-time helper left, and I can't find anybody to replace him. So I get to do the job.
This is where I asked if I could give her a ride home.
Yeah. And Thursdays and Wednesdays and Tuesdays. I feel like only contribution I go to the legal department is like stand off some money for spending on it and worry about it. And they're going to cut me a check.
Oh, that's nice. They would just
I'm familiar with those products.
Upstairs? Or like I'll try to
send it over.
All right. I'm not yelling. It's all right. All right, so you get me for the rest of the evening now. We're going to walk through how this is going to look for you guys, what things you should keep in mind when making your decisions. Again, ask questions. This is a lot of information, and these slides, at least when I was putting them together, they're not as exciting as my last slides. They don't have as many pictures because there weren't as many pictures that really related. So let's make this as interactive as we can rather than me just telling you things. All right, so the nuts and bolts of what the Board of Adjustment and Planning Commission and then on to the county board do, how it all works. Variances, and I know Eric touched on this a bit ago about kind of the planning department's goal is to make sure that people don't need variances. The idea is to find ways to work within the ordinance to achieve what it is that people want to do. Because a variance is an exception from the requirements of the zoning ordinance. So you've got your uses that are allowed or required here, or your structures that are allowed or required here, and what you want to do here, and they need to match whenever possible. Otherwise, you need a variance. The statute does say that you cannot have a use variance, and we will get into that shortly. And that basically means dimensional, so the standards, distances, I got my list here. The most common ones that we're seeing variances for over the last couple of years, looking back at my notes, are setbacks, the septic stuff, and prime soils. Those are kind of the big ones that we deal with regularly because those are common issues we have in Winona County. One of the key pieces for a variance is that all of the criteria have to be met, and that is a difference between variances and conditional use permits, and we'll talk about that when we get to conditional uses as well. The zoning ordinance chapter 5.6.2 talks about the variance criteria. There are 8 of them. In doing some research primarily related to this presentation that we've got here before us, we've come up with some concerns about the way that it's written in that they appear redundant in some places. The information's all correct, but we may be looking at discussing how we can make that clearer for you guys when applying the record to what the ordinance requires. But we'll talk about that when we get there. There are some additional variance criteria for the floodplain district and if there's an after the fact variance, and those are also found within the zoning ordinance. Let's see. This is different from conditional and interim uses. As of what month was that last year? October, September? Yeah. As of last fall, we now have interim uses here in Winona County, and all that means is that we have a conditional use that has a time limit or an event limit on it. These are things that are permitted when certain findings have been made. We can attach conditions to them. They're listed out within the zoning district what's a conditional or interim use. If all of the criteria and standards are met, they must be approved. But it can't just be based on what the board and commission wants to do. We actually have to base our decisions on the criteria and standards, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The difference between a conditional use permit and an interim use permit is that the conditional use permit remains with the property as long as those conditions remain satisfied, but it cannot have a sunset clause on it. I know we went round and round for those of you that were here last summer. You're familiar with this discussion, so I won't go into it anymore. An interim use permit is what we have in order to end a permit for something other than violating conditions. So if a specified event, and by specified I mean it is actually specified in the findings and the permit itself what that event is, or a specific date, so if there's a 5-year time period or if there's an actual date put in there, that's when it would end, or as long as the conditions are satisfied. And that as long as the conditions are satisfied piece is important. It's on both of them. That means that you can't just get the permit and do whatever you want. You actually have to do the things that you're required to do in order to keep it. Regardless of whether it's a variance, a conditional or interim use permit, there's an application process, and the applications are fairly similar for them. In fact, the conditional interim use permit is one application that you fill out, and then based on what you're requesting is how it's then moved forward. It's submitted on or before a deadline for submissions. Usually that is the Friday after the preceding regular meeting. So whenever we have those meetings, the next day is usually the deadline. or the applications for the upcoming month. Must include all of the items required in the ordinance as well as the check for the application fee. If anything is missing, then it's not considered complete and you will ask you for that additional information. It can't go forward until all that information has been received. But the fun part about all of this and why this is important for you guys to know is that it triggers the 60-day rule. Once that completed application has been received by the planning department, then we have 60 days for a decision to be made. And because lawyers were involved in all this, 60 days may or may not actually mean 60 days, because that's the way we like to do things. There's always exceptions to the rules. 60 days is your general rule. So whether it's a decision by the Board of Adjustment regarding a variance, whether it's the final decision by the county board regarding a conditional use permit, the statute says within 60 days. And if you fail to do that, then it's automatically approved. However, you can extend that period. And that period doesn't start unless the application is complete. You can extend it for an additional 60 days just with written notice. So if there's a reason to push something out 60 days, then planning department staff can just do that with a letter and say, we're providing you with notice, we're extending it 60 days, here's why, here's the date by which a decision will be made. Outside of that 120 days, so you've got your original 60 plus your new 60, anything beyond 120 days the applicant has to consent to. And then the other one, the most common, there's a couple other exceptions too that don't generally apply to the decisions we deal with as far as land use, is by operation of law. So if there's something that has to happen before we can move forward by some other law, whether it's state statute, administrative rules, things like that, if a mandatory process can't be completed within the 60 days, the clock basically stops. And the 60 days doesn't start until that process is finished. So I think some statutes have different timelines for when that decision might need to be made. But as long as that process is going forward, we're not allowed to make our decisions. And so 60 days doesn't apply. But I think you asked a question earlier about if you need additional information. This is where you can run into problems with it. Because if you need that additional information, the 60-day rule still applies. And so you might need to table things, we might need to seek extensions, we might need to get the applicant's agreement to extend things in order to table it and obtain the additional information you're looking for. So if you ever hear us talking about 60-day rule, and you will because we do bring that up during meetings, this is why it's an important rule, is because otherwise it's automatically approved. Yes?
I don't want to back up or anything, but I want to make sure I'm understanding all this. So the real difference between variance and a permit, sounds like there's a time constraint on permit?
No.
Variances?
No, that's not correct. So a variance is asking for an exception to the zoning ordinance. So it's, here's your rules, we want to do something that's outside of that. A conditional use or an interim use permit is saying these things are allowed with a specific kind of permit within the ordinance and we want to do that. And then the difference between the conditional use permit and the interim use permit is that time frame. Does that make sense?
Well, it talks about practical difficulty under the definition of variance.
Yep,
I guess that's
we will get there. We'll get there, I promise. Okay. So these are the things that have to happen within our 60-day timeline. So when you're talking about a variance, what we need to make sure gets done is the application is complete, triggers the 60 days. The staff report has to be assembled and completed. Notices have to go out. There has to be the Board of Adjustment meeting, which will include, and we're going to go through all these things and how they actually work, has to include the presentation, the public hearing, discussion, decision, and written findings. So all these things, 60 days. Fairly easily doable in most cases when it comes to a variance. Where it gets a little bit more complicated is with a conditional or interim use permit. Because with that, we not only need the application, the staff report, the notice, the meeting that has the presentation, public hearing, discussion, recommendation, and findings, but it also has to go to the county board for final approval. So we have to time when the planning commission meets and then when it gets onto the county board's agenda, because the county board's agenda is when that 60 days has to be up. And so getting through all those meetings with all the information getting obtained can sometimes be troublesome. I think we've run into that a couple times where the county board meeting that the conditional use permit would end up on was like day 61 or day 62, just by way things fell. And we have to pay attention to those things and make sure that the appropriate timelines are extended as needed. But we still have to get at least the decision, generally the written findings as well, within that 60-day time frame. Yes.
When we are considering a conditional use permit, how can, and we want some specific information from the applicant, can we as planning commission members ask staff to ask them for that specific information to try and speed up so we don't have to do the delays and stuff?
That would make sense to me.
We just would have to ask, or?
Sure. I mean, if it's something really out of the ordinary, there might be some discussion about it. But if it's, we want to make sure we've got this information, talk to staff, and they will see what they can do to make sure you've got it in front of you.
Okay.
That kind of assumes that we have the information far enough ahead of time to actually make that request. A lot of times we only get our packets a couple of
Well,
days.
yeah,
before
I
the
know
meeting.
that. And
Okay.
Stephanie
Right.
and I have had a couple go-arounds, particularly with, what is it, conservation stuff, where it's always late.
Yeah, there are certain
Yeah, soil and water.
areas that, we get the information the day of the meeting, and there's not a lot we can do about that, but we make our best efforts to get information obtained as quickly as possible and distributed as possible. It's just not always an option.
And then, Kelly, I throw in one more wrinkle, I don't have email.
Yep.
Never said the job was easy.
Nope.
Intense. We have driven some packets out to your house, though.
I got one to during my stay in St. Anne.
Yep, I do remember that.
We shame on you.
We will do whatever we can to make sure you guys have the information as soon as possible. It's just, there are constraints on what we can do. If we could conjure it up, we would. So with all of that, then everybody within this has varying roles and responsibilities. There's things we can do and things we can't do. The planning department, their role in all of this, they start by reviewing the application for completeness. They have a timeline on when they can say this application is not complete and ask for that additional information. They are working on developing the application materials, so they're reaching out to some of those external departments, agencies, whatever, to get the information and so that they can write their staff report. Do a site visit. Everybody's familiar with the videos that you can see or pictures of the sites. They're developing their staff report and their presentations for the hearings. They're in communication with the applicants, trying to make sure that all the information's there, that they're getting any additional information that's being requested, but also that the applicant knows what their obligations are when it comes to the meeting. They're preparing and publishing the hearing notices because we have statutory and ordinance-based timelines for when those have to go out and who those have to go out to, and preparing and distributing your agenda packets. So they've got a lot going on in a fairly short time frame, because if you think about it, like we have our March meeting next week. Our regularly scheduled March meeting would be next week on the 21st. 4 weeks later, we have the regularly scheduled, February meeting on the 21st. We have 4 weeks later, March 21st is the next meeting. That's 4 weeks to get all of this done and get that agenda packet out, a week in advance? Yeah, 1 week in advance. So we have 3 weeks to assemble all of this and get it out to you on top of everything else that you heard Kay and Eric talk about what they're doing. So they're working hard and trying to make sure that this information is getting distributed. County Attorney's Office, our role, as Karin talked about briefly, is to provide you with advice. Board of Adjustment, Planning Commission, County Board, we advise you on legal issues. We provide representation in certain things. Karin did talk about NCIT, so when things get to a certain level, we hand it off to them, and then they get to deal with it. But in the meantime, it's up to us to make sure that we're representing the county and the county's interests. And that's the county as a whole. And enforcement. So Eric talked briefly about enforcing. Our office works with the planning department so that when there are violations, we're pursuing them with the appropriate legal remedies, whether it's civil or criminal or however we're working through that. We do not have any role or authority in making substantive land use decisions. We don't get to decide how things play out. We just get to advise you on the proper process and procedures, which is what I'm doing here tonight. We can give you advice on the legal issues, our interpretation of how whatever is before you meets the law and the legal standards. But at the end, it is up to the Board of Adjustment, the Planning Commission, and the County Board to make their independent decisions. That goes back to that quasi-judicial aspect that Karin talked about. You take the facts, you apply it to the law, and determine what the outcome is. You're the decision maker. Just like a jury is in a criminal case, you're the decision maker whether or not something is or is not met. You're not required to follow our advice, but I will tell you that our goal is to keep you and the county in minimal trouble. Can't always keep you out of trouble, especially some of you, but minimal trouble, and to make sure that whatever your decision is, and I think I was talking with somebody about this before our training tonight, whatever your decision is, we just want to make sure that it is supported with the record and procedurally accurate so that it can be upheld going forward through the court system if need be. You guys, board and commission members, you have certain roles and responsibilities. I know the very exciting one is to attend meetings. I know everybody loves more meetings. Be informed about the issues that are being heard. And that really means do your homework. I know I don't have to tell most of you to do that, but I always like to highlight it. Review your agenda materials in advance of the meeting. I know sometimes you get some things the day of, and we can't help that, but review your materials. Be familiar with your comprehensive plan and your zoning ordinance. If you need a copy, let us know. We'll make sure you get one. Otherwise, they are available on the website. And in particular, when you're reviewing your applications, look up those provisions. We cite the zoning ordinance and the comprehensive plan in the staff reports and any legal analysis. Look it up. Make sure that you know what it says, because you're the one that has to take what you're hearing from testimony, what you're hearing from everything else, and apply that to what the law requires. The Planning Commission, some of their roles in all of this are to assist in preparing and reviewing the comprehensive plan. That's one of those legislative roles that we talked about, and recommend adoption or amendments. We went through a nice big one or two last year, so there may be more coming, you never know, but there's always things to tweak with the zoning ordinance because society changes, like any other law. Assist in preparing or reviewing the official controls, that again, legislative. So that's your comprehensive plan, that's the zoning ordinance, that's maps, any of those things that might need to be amended. Review and make recommendations on community development proposals, rezoning, subdivisions, conditional use permits, that's quasi-judicial. That's where you're reviewing the record and applying that to the law. And getting, yes?
Again, all we're doing is making recommendations on the
Correct.
planning commission. We are not making any decisions on them.
Correct. But you are holding the public hearing, which is a very crucial piece in that decision-making process. And that's that last bullet point.
It may be a piece in the process, but that's not, in my mind, that does not fulfill the requirements of being a quasi-judicial law.
It does, in that you are taking the facts and applying them to the law. It might just be we're recommending that you see it this way, but more often than not, what we're seeing is rubber stamping of your recommendation, because you're the one being able to interact with the applicant at the public hearing. You're the one that's being able to interact with the people that are coming up to testify. You're the one that's seeing that material firsthand. You're that initial decision maker. It may not be the final decision, but you are the one that is making that decision and putting that on paper. So it might get tweaked or changed later on, but always think of it as it needs to be supportable no matter what you do at your level, not just the county boards. All right, Board of Adjustment. If a county adopts official controls, it has to have a Board of Adjustment. So if we have our comprehensive plan and our zoning ordinance, we have to have a Board of Adjustment. The county board cannot, by statute, be the Board of Adjustment. So it has to be something separate. Your county, this is a separation of powers kind of issue. You've got your county board that makes the laws, and you've got your Board of Adjustment that interprets those laws. So That's your legislative and your judicial branches. County commissioners are also not allowed to serve on the Board of Adjustment. One county commissioner is on the Planning Commission, but there are no county commissioners on our Board of Adjustment. And that's Minnesota Statute 394.27 Subdivision 5. Their role is to hear and issue decisions on variance applications, enforcing the ordinance unless there is an exception where variance is appropriate. That's throughout case law, that the idea is that those ordinances are there for a reason, that those police powers protecting the health, safety, and welfare of the public. So there has to be a really good reason why you're not enforcing that ordinance in order to make that exception. Also, hearing and deciding appeals from planning department action. So those certificates and permits and administrative actions that Eric was talking about earlier, if somebody doesn't like that decision, the Board of Adjustment is the place that they go to appeal what Eric decided. I don't remember, when was the last time we heard one of those?
Oh, it's been about 10 years.
So it's because Eric makes good decisions.
Stephanie, one other thing about the Board of Adjustments. The composition of it is such that there's one member that can be inside a city, and then the other 4 members are from the rural townships.
Yep. It can be all 5 rural, but one city is allowed if appointed. All right. The last piece of this is the county board, and Karin touched on this. They have the legislative function of adopting and amending the official controls, making those final decisions, rezoning property, imposing moratoria, and their quasi-judicial function of issuing conditional use permits and approving those preliminary and final plats. So a lot of these are, the reason why there's a planning commission is to make the recommendations to the county board. It takes some of the burden, not all of the burden, off the county board to collect and gather all the relevant information and present it to them, as opposed to the county board having to do all of that on top of everything else that they're responsible for. A chairperson. I know everybody loves to be the chairperson of major boards, especially when they're public and on, may or may not be taped and on TV. But the role of a chairperson is to ensure that proper meeting procedures being followed. Generally, and we'll talk about this in a minute, we follow Robert's rules or Bob's guidelines, depending on how informal the meeting is. We ensure that decorum of the proceedings is taking place. And that means not just amongst the board members themselves, although that is a key part because they're representing the county, but also, that staff is maintaining decorum because we can get unruly sometimes. Citizens, the people in the audience, the media, anybody that's in the room, making sure that it's an orderly process so that due process, equal protection, all of those things are maintained. And then you get to sign findings, minutes on behalf of the board. One of the things that a chair can also do is establish some rules for that to enforce that decorum. So some of the more contentious things we've done, like the silica sand, when was that, a couple years ago, there were rules that were put in place for the proceedings to make sure that everybody was aware of how to proceed, and those were made public. A lot of times we don't put time limits on speakers because there's only going to be 1 or 2 speakers, but when you're going to talk about lots more, we put some limitations on there in order to ensure the decorum of the proceedings.
Stephanie, at the Board of Adjustment in particular, the meeting minutes says they adopted the rules of procedure. Are those rules of procedure somewhere available on the website?
They're not on the website,
But
right?
I'm just not totally clear what the rules of procedure are.
You can get them from Kay if they're not. I don't think they're available on the website, but we can make sure those are available to anybody that wants them.
It just says they adopted them, no changes were made.
Yep.
A couple of weeks ago.
And they're in the packets of the Board of Adjustment members, and then we'll have the sort of rules of order posted at meetings that tend to be larger meetings, too.
You could send a copy of that.
Yes.
Please, thank you.
Does the Board of Adjustments follow Robert's rules and orders for letting the public speak by just putting their name in at the beginning of the meeting, that they do intend to stand up? Or is a person who talked to me today correct in reading in the newspaper that we had to submit something a week ahead of the meeting to say we wanted to speak publicly?
For the upcoming Board of Adjustment meeting, there's a couple of ways that they can provide comment. One is submitting in writing in advance, or you can, when you arrive at the meeting, you'll be able to register in order to speak at that meeting. With some of the more contentious ones, we put deadlines on submitting written comments, because that way there's enough time for the board or the planning commission to review them. We want them in time for the packets so that everybody gets distributed. It's not intended to, we're still taking it, but best practice for us is to get it as far in advance so that the information can go out. Yep. Yeah, there's no prohibition on providing those oral comments. We're not going to restrict those.
The oral or written comments are supposed to be weighed the same, right?
Any information provided to you in any format is to be weighed based on your discretion. You get to decide how much weight to give any particular piece of information. And we'll talk about that when we get to the record. All right, so to summarize, staff provides you with information and legal and procedural opinions, identifying the applicable controls, the criteria, some of the relevant facts related to criteria, and making recommendations to you. The commission and board members either makes or recommends findings based on the information in the record, determines which facts support those findings made, and establishes any conditions that are appropriate. Once we have all of the pieces in place, notice goes out. Notice is required for there to be a public hearing. A public hearing on a petition or ordinance amendment requires notice published at least 10 days in advance. Notice to neighboring properties, townships, or municipalities might be required. And the big piece to all this is we cannot hold the hearing without proper notice. Was it last year or the year before? I think there was a planning commission one where 5 of the 6 notices got published and the 6th one didn't. And so we show up that night and we're like, we can't have a public hearing. We had to send a couple of people home because they knew that was going to be on the agenda, but we couldn't hold the public hearing because it hadn't been properly published. So
I think that the latest thing I heard about that was, and it wasn't in Winona County, but in Iowa, they were going to have a school referendum vote, and they sent the notice to the official paper, but they didn't get, the paper didn't publish the ballot, so they had to reschedule the election.
yep, and that was our issue whenever that was, that we had sent all 6 and they missed one when they printed. So it's one of those things that we do the best we can, but sometimes things happen and we have to hold off on it in order to comply with requirements. Our regularly scheduled public meetings may not require notice, so we don't have to necessarily provide notice of the, third Thursday of the month. We have a Board of Adjustment meeting and we have a Planning Commission meeting. But all the petitions that are on the docket or any ordinance amendments under consideration that we might be having a public hearing on, those pieces have to have the notice. So that means we're not providing one notice about a docket that has 5 petitions, we're providing 5. So lots of notice going on out there, but I know the planning department staff does a great job staying on top of those. Once we get to the meeting, we have kind of an established order of events that we follow. Always starts with the staff presentation. They're going to give you the highlights from the staff report, what property we're talking about, hopefully a video, and then the applicant has an opportunity to provide their presentation. The burden is on the applicant to justify whatever they're asking for. Staff's not here to make the argument for them. The obligation is on them. Then we have a public hearing, and we're going to go into these a little more in depth here in a minute too. And then after the public hearing, if necessary, the applicant does have an opportunity to provide rebuttal or additional information that might have come up as a result of the public hearing. Then we get into the board and commission discussion. A decision gets made and written findings get generated. For those of you that, I think everybody's been through a meeting so far with a petition, right? So as you know, we try to provide draft findings for you to start with, because what that means is that as we tweak them throughout, then at the end of the meeting, I hit print and the chairs can sign them and they're ready to go right there. So we're generally submitting those written findings at the same time the decision's being made. So we talked a minute ago about decorum and parliamentary procedure, Robert's Rules of Order. The purpose for that is standard procedures. It avoids confusion, protects citizen rights. General motion process is that the person that wants to make a motion gets recognized by the chair. Then they make their motion. Then there's a second to the motion. Then the chair repeats that motion and asks for discussion. for Ann's not over there. For Ann's benefit, we generally also like it if you say so-and-so made the motion and so-and-so seconded it so that it's clear for the record, because everything's being recorded. And then asks for discussion. And then you talk when the chair recognizes you, and when discussion's complete or the question's been called, there's a vote. I know some of the questions that we've gotten about rules, parliamentary procedure before is, can a motion be withdrawn? And the answer to that is, before the chair has repeated it, according to Robert's rules, yes. After the chair has repeated that motion, only if nobody objects. Once the chair repeats to the motion, it is assumed to belong to the entire panel and can't be changed without consent of the panel. So it's not just the person making the motion and the second. I know I've heard that a couple of times where it's like, friendly amendment, is it okay if we change this? And they're like, sure, you can change my motion, and I'll agree with that as a second, and we go forward. As long as everybody, the panel, agrees with that, it's easy to do. Otherwise, you would need to amend the motion formally.
Stephanie, do you want to mention what happens when there's a motion but no second?
Then the motion fails for lack of a second.
How many times do we have to ask for a second? Or just once?
Yeah, just once. Let silence speak. You know, it might help if you ask more than once, but I don't think it's required.
If someone makes, let's say, a
Friendly amendment?
friendly amendment, but the person who made the original motion doesn't consider it friendly, or, you know,
Then we would,
doesn't approve.
then we would want to talk about amending a motion. So with that, this is where it gets complicated, and this is where, as a chair, you should know that staff is usually taking lots of notes, and we can tell you we're nesting things. So when I'm taking my notes over there, I know what the motion is, and then if there's an amendment, I know what that amendment is, and if there's another amendment to that amendment, I know what it is, and then you have to work backwards through them on voting. So we're happy to help out and help you figure out what the next question that should be voted on is.
Can that friendly or not friendly amendment be amended to the original motion, even if the original
Yes.
mover doesn't want that to happen?
If they make it a formal amendment and that amendment passes. So, yep. So if you say, I move for chocolate ice cream, and that gets seconded, and somebody else says, I want to amend that, I want ice cream, but how about strawberry? And then somebody else says Neapolitan, then it would have to be a motion to amend if you didn't think that we should have vanilla or strawberry. Does that make sense? It gets complicated, it's nested, and we'll help you through it. I promise. Yes.
Question that's been raised is on the Board of Adjustment, and again, this is your operating rules, is the chair allowed to make motions? Because the county board, we changed that.
Right. I don't remember what the rules of procedure said. I know we talked about two different sets of rules of procedure that day, and it'll be in the rules of procedure, and okay.
I believe it says no,
That's
and
what I
they can
think.
only, and they shouldn't second a motion, but they can vote at their discretion on any.
Yeah.
No motion, no second, we can vote, but, and if there's not a full attendance, then full voting rights should be given to the chair.
Right, because I know when we've had the three people, the chair's been allowed to second things. Usually it doesn't. Usually just alternates who's making the motion and second. But yes.
When we get done with the public hearing, and we go into discussion, who's allowed to speak? Is anybody allowed to speak from the audience?
We'll get to
and
that.
ask a question?
We will get to that. We're still on staff presentation.
Okay.
We're getting there, I promise. Working through this. I just want to give you the overview, like the broad procedures, and now we're going to talk about them in depth. So, Eric talked a little bit about it, but the staff presentation, they provide their report, which is part of your meeting packet, additional information that has been received since that. So a lot of times when you have that additional information sitting in front of you when you get here for your meeting, it'll be mentioned by staff as far as what that is. The video of the area, and then they'll answer any questions about the information provided. That's a really good opportunity for, if there's questions you have right then, ask them then. You want to get as much information out as possible. From there, we go into the applicant presentation. They have an opportunity to explain their request. They're not required to. It's an opportunity. But they get to explain what they're requesting, why they are requesting it, and how they believe it meets the criteria for issuing the variance, CUP, or IUP. You can also ask questions of the applicant regarding their request at this time. So ask all the questions that you have when you were doing your homework and reading through your application materials. Think it through. Are there questions that come up to you then? Make notes and be prepared to ask those during the staff or the applicant's presentation. Once the applicant is done, then we go into the public hearing, and I know this is always the fun part, where we have to have a motion, second, discussion, and vote to open our public hearing. Then the chair gets to announce that those wishing to speak for or against should step forward. I touched on this earlier that contentious hearings, or even a general rule of practice, you can have rules regarding the public hearing. Usually better if there's written rules and those are distributed or noted prior to the meeting, because we don't want to be springing rules on people right then and there. It's not necessarily fair to them if they didn't know their rules beforehand. But some of those are, yeah.
Who am I supposed to have be the timekeeper?
If there's going to be a time limit, let us know and we will have somebody that will keep time.
So typically at a meeting, administrative staff has a computer-generated 2-minute timer clicking down.
Yeah. Or whoever, because she likes to take vacation.
Yeah.
And it's on the screen.
It's on the screen, right. And
But I'm supposed to enforce it, right?
Yes, you are. It's the fun part. That's what the gavel's for.
I can think of other uses.
You and me both. So the limiting to 2 minutes or one time each, things like that are some of those restrictions that you can impose. Requiring sign-in, calling in order, things like that. You don't have to, and a lot of times we run them a little more informally, where people just come to the podium, state their name and address, and get to talk. But for some of the bigger ones, a lot of times we have a little more structure to them because it keeps things flowing better. Yes?
Stepping back just a little bit, when the petitioner speaks before the public hearing, is there a time frame for that?
Not unless you require it. So then, next part of the public hearing is that once the chair has called for people to come to the podium, they can do that, provide information, state opinions. You always want to make sure they state their name and address first. If your rules allow for it, they may speak again to address any concerns or information. Rules also might say you only get to speak once. It really depends on how the chair's decided to run that meeting and what the presented rules from the beginning are. Board, I know this one comes up a lot, board and commission members can ask questions of people that are speaking during the public hearing. If there's a time limit, responding to those questions, as long as they are staying within the scope of said question, will not count against their time limit, because it's providing the information that the planning or the Board of Adjustment or Planning Commission is asking for. Chair always has to announce 3 times to see if those wishing to speak want to come forward, and then there's a motion, second, and discussion and vote to close the public hearing. Any other questions about the public hearing piece of this?
If you made the motion second to open it and ask, if there's anyone to speak for or against, then when you reach the end of all the people, do you have to say it 3 more times or just 2 times? It's on my mind.
I don't know. I honestly, I'm not 100% sure I know where the 3 times comes from. I just know that's what we do.
Have you done one of them when you started?
I think if there's crickets, you're probably safe as long as you've said it 3 times at some point in there. If you say it, one person comes forward. You say it, one person comes forward. You say it.
Make sure you say it at the end.
Yeah. As long as you got it one more time before you close it, you're good. You should be good. But, when in doubt, always ask again.
Counselor, I've been used to always hearing that one of the rules is that the board or deliberative body does not engage the person providing information in debate.
Yes. This is not a time for debate. This is a time to seek information. So which are very different. The debate gets to come in discussion when you're talking amongst yourselves, but it's not with the person at the podium. It's just get the information so that you can then have a reasonable debate with your colleagues. Yes.
In answer to a previous question about the petitioner's presentation, the question was, is there a time limit for that? And your answer was not unless you require it. So what is the process by which one would require it? Would it be at the discretion of the chair? Would it be?
Probably for decorum purposes, because that's generally why we establish rules, is in order to have an orderly proceeding, not exceed the scope of things, make sure everything is flowing properly, but also keeping in mind that everybody has a right to be heard and present their information. So I think keeping all those things in mind, it would depend on the circumstances.
Once in a while, I have seen it where a chair has, in the past, not necessarily here, has curtailed discussion when the same points are being repetitive, they're repeating, they're going over the same ground, which they made clear in prior discussion, or in prior points.
Yep.
So, when it comes to clarifying zoning law, things that we find in our comp plan, zoning ordinances, at what point does that get introduced into the meeting? Can a person who represents a commission, like say if I attended the Board of Adjustments next week, as a planning commissioner, commissioner member, could I stand up and state
Probably not in your role as a planning commission member.
the zoning laws, even if I'm just stating the facts of zoning laws and not saying how I feel one way or the other? Could I clarify?
They should have the zoning laws already. They
So,
do have the zoning laws already.
who's they?
The Board of Adjustment. That's the role of staff. We provide them with the applicable ordinances, et cetera. If there's additional information that a citizen has to provide, they can provide that. But as a planning commission member, I think that goes back to what Karin was talking about earlier. What role are you in? And being careful not to cross the lines into advocating for positions and things like that for something that might come before you.
So what if it's overlooked? What if it's something that's not stated and it's still just reading zoning law or something in the ordinance plan? It's just a matter of reading and bringing it to people's attention.
Mike, why don't you call the county attorney's office and we'll talk about what that is. We'll figure out.
It kind of goes beyond the scope of the training, but you do have to remember your roles and not kind of cross over into each body's
Exactly.
deliberations.
I'm hoping they do their homework.
Well, but,
They're there and they don't.
well, but then the staff is here. We have, Stephanie is the attorney handling Board of Adjustment and also Planning Commission. And so, yeah, if you have concerns, it's best to bring them to my office or to Kay. But I think it would be, frankly, I would think it would be inappropriate for you to stand up at a Board of Adjustment meeting and speak to the Board of Adjustment members as a Planning Commission member. I mean, one of the first things I was taught when I became a county attorney was you are always the county attorney wherever you are, okay? So once people know you're a Planning Commission member, you are always a Planning Commission member in the public. So, again, I mean, I as an attorney, I probably take a more cautious point, but we do have to protect the record. We do have to protect the proceedings, so.
Think of it as living in a fishbowl.
Yeah.
Yes.
Related to that is if somebody on the board is misinterpreting an ordinance, will the staff correct?
Usually, and I don't know about misinterpreting, misstating, absolutely. We will correct things when necessary, whether that's Eric, who knows the zoning ordinance backwards, forwards, and everything in between, or myself, or Kay, or somebody. If we're hearing misstatements, we will correct that. If we're hearing mistakes, we will correct that. If it's a misinterpretation, it might be a little different because their job is to interpret whether the information meets whatever the legal standard is. So that one would be a little gray area, and it would depend on the circumstances.
If we didn't have
Right? Yeah, if you didn't need interpretation, I would be out of a job. Let's put it that way.
So it's all subject to interpretation, because it was written by the law system, the legal system, and that's what the law is. It's interpretation of a set of rules.
That's why we have the judicial branch. There's a whole branch of government that deals with that. So, one more.
Yeah,
We gotta get to the record and the fun parts.
petitioner can ask for something even if it is in violation of zoning ordinance, and petitioner can ask even if it's in direct conflict.
They can,
Kind of why we're all here, that's the game we're playing, right?
there can always be a request. We will follow the law to the best of our abilities. And that's everybody's job. That's the board, the planning commission, the board of adjustment, staff. So, on to the record. I know this is a big topic, but this one came up a couple of times, particularly relating to our Silica Sand Fund, was what is the record? The record, a big reason for parliamentary procedures to ensure the record, what's being voted on, what is the outcome, and how were decisions reached. The entire hearing should be about the record. What's the information? That's your application materials, your staff report, your submitted materials, your testimony. Everything that's all coming in is what you need to be considering. And then what's the final conclusion? What are the decisions and recommendations and the findings based on that information and how it's being used to reach your decision, which is your discussion piece. The purpose of the record is to facilitate judicial review, although we hope we never get there. We really hope that this doesn't get to the point where we need to have judicial review, but just in case, we need to make sure it's sufficient. Yes. We always assume it's going to happen, and then we love it when it doesn't. But we need to make sure that the decision's being based on legitimate, legally sufficient reasons and not the mere whim of the members. One of the pieces that has come up in a couple of trainings that we've attended is that neighborhood sentiment based on concrete information can be taken into consideration, but it may not constitute the sole basis for approval or denial. I think that was 2 trainings that Jay Squires did for us. Talked about that aspect of the neighborhood sentiment. You can, and we talked about this a little bit ago, you can discount information or evidence that lacks relevance or credibility. If you as a Board of Adjustment member or Planning Commission member or County Board member even don't find the information credible, give it the weight that you think it deserves. So if you find some things more plausible than others, rely on that. You are free to disregard an opinion when presented with conflicting opinions, and that includes area residents if reasons are concrete based on observation of facts in the record. But the big rule of thumb in all of this is to make sure that whatever your decision is, it's addressed as part of your discussion and on the record. So, yes.
Is neighborhood sentiment the test of public testimony?
No. Neighborhood sentiment a lot of times has more to do with opinions than, I think this is what it's going to do to my neighborhood, as opposed to I have research and evidence that says that if this happens, this will happen. So things like that. Neighborhood sentiment, not considered as, you shouldn't rely on it as much as the actual facts, but you can take it into consideration. So discussion is among the board or commission members regarding the request. It is not among board or commission members and the members of the audience. It's not among board and commission members and the applicant. You're not here to discuss things back and forth between those. It's discussion amongst yourselves. Part of the reason why we allow for questions during the public hearing and during the applicant's presentation is to avoid calling people back to the podium to talk again, because a lot of times what happens is you start engaging in discussion and debate with them. And we want to avoid that, because the information gathering portion, to the extent possible, should be complete. You should be discussing all the information and trying to make your decision at that point. Your discussion should relate to how the facts in the record, or information in the record, if you don't want to call them facts, your reports, your information, your testimony, show that applicable criteria have or have not been met, and what conditions should be required based on those criteria. That's what your goal with all of this is.
Question.
Yep.
Just back to the procedural part of this. So if you're in the discussion phase and someone in the audience, whether it be the petitioner or another citizen, pops up and starts talking.
The chair should shut them down.
Okay.
If there's information that is appropriate at that point, the chair may choose to recognize and get that information, but in general, that's disruptive. It's not necessarily as helpful as the information should have been obtained earlier, unless there is a need.
Someone that's not sitting on the commission or board should not be speaking
Correct.
unless recognized or called upon.
Correct.
Thank you.
Yes.
History, I've had a number of planning department heads in my time of service, and at one point we had a planning director who gave kind of a pros and cons. You could approve this because of this, or you could not approve it because of this. Now I'm reading, and I've been following and I'm assuming it's primarily your job to put these findings of fact together on these things.
Based on the staff reports, yes.
So, and they definitely have an influence. So you're not really leaving it up to the interpretation of the committee members on the Board of Adjustment. Your recommendation here is leading the conversation one way or the other. So does the applicant also have legal counsel to represent them and present a different side?
They probably could if they wanted to. And what we have always said, and we're getting to the findings of fact now, is that we're providing you with a draft based on what the staff report has, the staff's analysis. They tend to be the experts in their area, in particular in the zoning ordinance. They're taking the facts. They know what generally meets and doesn't meet criteria. So we're providing them with a draft to start with. I know it's a lot easier sometimes to make a decision based on a starting point.
It doesn't say draft.
Yes, it does.
Not what I'm reading.
They should. When in the packets, the version that we hand out says draft, because I make sure that watermark is on there.
It's not on the electronic.
We'll have to take a look at that. But yes, when we get to those meetings, they are editable, and we've done that more than once, where you may disagree with what the analysis is, and we sit there during the meeting, we change it, the will to will not, or vice versa, and we craft what language belongs in that paragraph in order to apply the information to that criteria to say what the Board of Adjustment or the Planning Commission wants. And that's why I don't hit print until the end, is because we wait until it's been approved and then we print it the way that they wanted it.
Okay, so going back to my original, where the one planning director would lay it out both ways. You can do this, you can do that. So in your perspective of doing this, and in your training and everything, is it just, this is the way it is, instead of laying out alternatives? And why would one planning director have done that? And we worked on it at council for a number of years.
I think it's a matter of preference.
Personal preference?
Yep, because and there's a lot of times where there's not really one way or the other. There's a lot of times where it's pretty clear cut. There's other times where it's not. I think in the last couple of years since I've been doing the draft findings, there have been a couple of times where we've said, this one could go either way. Here's things that could go this direction. Here's things that could go that direction. And which way do you want to go?
So that tends to be represented in the staff reports as things that meet the criteria and things that don't meet the criteria. And depending on if it's Planning Commission or Board of Adjustment, because the sets of findings of facts are slightly different, Board of Adjustment, they all have to be met. We take the facts that we can find or that have been provided or that outside experts or outside agencies have provided to us, assemble all that in a technical report with zoning and planning staff, and then lay it out and review it with the legal department. And so that's our current operating procedure.
Yep, I basically take the staff report. Most of the time, what you will see is a copy and paste of the staff analysis into the findings of fact. Sometimes I try to trim it down and make it a little more concise or summarize. But for the most part, it should be based on what the staff report says. Did I see? Yes.
What are we going to do now? We don't have Donnie Evanson to be our critiquer.
Get done faster?
I hope you're right. But every one of those findings of fact, we would come up with an alternative.
But sometimes we had some really well-crafted findings on those now, didn't we?
Well, yeah, I realize, but he isn't
But that's the point of all of this, is the discussion to make sure that those findings reflect the will of the body. So we're always willing to amend them. I will sit there and wordsmith all night if you need me to, and we'll get it done the way that the board or the planning commission wants it. Your findings of fact, however, have to be based on sufficient evidence. So it's not just conclusions. You're not just saying, oh God, what was the one I saw earlier? Will or will not create a traffic hazard or congestion. You can't just say this criteria is met because it will not create a traffic hazard or congestion. That's conclusory. That's just restating what it was. You have to tell me why. The findings, the analysis, the stuff in the italics on our findings of fact, that's the why is this criteria? What is it in all the information you have in front of you that makes this statement true or not true? So they have to be contemporaneous with the decision, which basically means as long as you're discussing it and discussing the reasons why you're making findings, it's sufficient. We can reduce it to writing later if need be, but you have to be, as you're making your decision, justifying that decision based on what's in front of you. That's what ensures the reliability and precludes the after-the-fact justification for decisions. So you can't make a decision and then when somebody says, that was a bad decision, why did you make it? Go back and go, well, because this, and this, right? Okay, good. The courts won't uphold that. They'll throw it back, and a lot of times they just approve whatever the issue was, whatever the applicant wanted gets approved because you didn't make appropriate findings, or they will kick it back to you to make those findings depending on what the situation is. But the big deal is just the facts.
I put that back in. I like that
like
picture.
I do like that one.
Surprise.
Yep. Just the facts. You want to apply, and this is the big piece that I think sometimes gets swapped around. You apply the facts to the law. So you take everything that you have for the facts. I don't remember if I took a couple of slides out. I don't remember if I put it in here. But you take your facts and you narrow it down to see whether or not that fits the law. You don't say, here's my facts. Which laws support this? Okay, I want to use those. That's not the way this works. You apply all the facts, everything you've got, and see what the outcome is with the law. Don't ignore the law when it doesn't suit your facts. Don't ignore facts that don't go towards the outcome that you want it to be. In the findings of fact, we can address those. And I think we've seen that in a couple of them where it's, although X, Y, and Z, we're doing this because, and that's acceptable. Yeah.
Okay, so isn't the variance being generated from the fact that it's creating a condition that doesn't follow the law?
But the law allows for variances. So it's still within the law because the law allows for it under certain circumstances.
And sometimes you would say in the fact finding that you can't support this because it isn't being supported by the compound. Well, isn't that the reason why we're applying for the variance anyway?
The short answer is it depends. It depends on the circumstances. And when it talks about, there might be one provision in the zoning ordinance that prohibits something, but what about the purpose and intent of the ordinance as a whole? What about the purpose and intent of the district? What about the purpose and intent of the comp plan? All of that might say, yeah, this restriction, but in this particular case, when it meets all these other criteria, there's a reason why it still meets the intent and purpose of the ordinance, even though this provision might not be met.
We talk about the comp plan. A lot of times people will take one sentence or one little area of the comp plan and not look at the comp plan as a whole. And yet that's considered, like you said, a finding of fact when, you should take the entire comprehensive, that's what it's called, a comprehensive plan.
Look at all the relevant information.
All the relevant information. Look at how it affects everything all over instead of just one little sentence here.
I would not disagree with that. All right, so we're going longer than I thought. I thought we were going to cruise through this. You guys are asking good questions. All right, so findings of fact should be a decision as supported by the facts in the record that are going to be reduced to written findings as to the criteria and signed by the chair. For simple findings, we do them right in the meeting, even sometimes the more complex ones. If we have really, really complex ones that need additional things, we can deal with that at a later date and come back and approve them later, as long as the discussion was at the time that the decision was made. All right, on to the criteria, which I know everybody is so very excited to discuss. And we're going to go through these fairly quickly. I was going to do some examples, but we're running out of time, so I'm not going to. These are just some highlights and things to keep in mind when doing your decision making. For a variance, in general, you have to make 8 findings. All of these things have to be true in order for a variance to be issued. That it has to be in harmony with the intent and purpose of the ordinance, consistent with the comprehensive plan. There have to be practical difficulties in complying, and it has to be done in a reasonable manner. There has to be unique circumstances not created by the owner, not alter the essential character or substantially impair others. No, not based on economic considerations alone, no reasonable alternative, and the minimum necessary to achieve what's desired, and not a use variance or not less restrictive than state law. We're going to talk about each of these a little bit more in depth. So, first is that the request is in harmony with the intent and purpose of the ordinance. That's the purpose and intent generally stated in the ordinance, and like we talked about a minute ago, you consider the ordinance as a whole as well as any applicable or relevant sections of the ordinance. So look at everything, not just one sentence. Determine what the intent and purpose is, and then look at your information and determine whether the request is in harmony with that, or even mostly in harmony with that. You want to figure out, does what you have in front of you mean that this criteria should be considered met or not? The request is consistent with the comprehensive plan. Again, the comprehensive plan as a whole, as well as any individual areas. It's important to understand what the comprehensive plan says. That's why you should actually read it. It's actually kind of interesting. When I first started doing the planning department stuff, I sat down and read the comprehensive plan. It was a lot more interesting than the zoning ordinance.
Hey, wait a minute, we like our zoning ordinance.
I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the zoning ordinance. The comp plan was just a little more interesting. More readable, there we go. Yeah. So understand what it says and then determine whether the information that you have is or is not consistent with that. This is where things get a little confusing. And in prepping for this, who was it mentioned earlier about the definition of practical difficulties in the statute? Yeah, it's complicated. So practical difficulties as defined in the statute encompasses about 4 of the variance criteria, which makes it really hard sometimes to interpret well. But what it means, practical difficulties, so the applicant has established that there are practical difficulties in complying with the official control. Practical difficulties has 3 components by definition. One is that it's being used in a reasonable manner, which is also included as a second component of this criteria. So that seems a little redundant to me, but maybe that's, just my read. But it has to be reasonable. Reasonable is that the proposal itself must be reasonable. It's not asking whether or not there's no other reasonable option. That actually is addressed by a different criteria. But just the question with this one is what is being proposed reasonable? The other pieces of practical difficulties are that it's unique circumstances not created by the owner, which is criteria 4, and the essential character of the location, which is criteria 5. So we'll talk about those next. But see why it's circular? Because you've got one that references practical difficulties, but then other criteria that also go back to practical difficulties. So you can't really find practical difficulties up front necessarily, but it's complicated. 4, that the request is due to special conditions or circumstances unique to the property and not created by the property owner since enactment of the ordinance. There's a lot of pieces to this one. One is unique conditions or circumstances must relate to the property, whether that's topography, the shape, so your steep slopes, your, is the property weird shapes? Is it Dresbach that has the weird shapes that result in all the septic issues? Yeah. So, there's some really skinny parcels that were developed before we had the ordinance that said you can't have those. And so now one of their unique circumstances is their shape because they can't do what we want them to do with this one. Where they're located might have something to do with their unique circumstances. Physical ordinance restrictions, if there's a whole bunch of ordinances that pile on top of each other, or various setbacks that make them unique, those special conditions, that might be sufficient to meet this. And then the character of the area can also be considered. But at the end of the day, the big question is, what is it that distinguishes this property from the neighboring properties or others in a similar situation? Because what you're doing with variances, remember, is exceptions. So you want to make sure that there's a reason to justify your exception in treating somebody differently than others that are similarly situated. It's not based on what the owner's proposing. It's the property itself that should be considered. Not created by the owner. That includes decisions being made, investments being made. One of the cases that I read was that the owner's decision to buy 3 properties in a row meant that it wasn't a special condition or circumstance when he was now required to merge all those properties because they were all substandard and didn't meet it. So he was trying to say that it was unique because he didn't own all of those in the beginning, but as soon as he did, he was no longer under that. And then since enactment of the ordinance, that's the restriction itself, not the ordinance as a whole. So the fact that we might adopt a brand new ordinance, when was the last time? 2011. So the fact that we adopted a new ordinance in 2011 doesn't mean that it reset the clock on all decisions. It's when was the provision established that we're relating to. Because a lot of those provisions we just took and moved over.
Isn't our comp plan out of compliance by date? Isn't it supposed to be reviewed every 10 years?
10.
So it's
Comp plan is 2014.
The Metro is automatic 10 years, controlled by the Met Council, but there's a little more latitude in rural counties. But it's acceptable custom to do it every 10 years. We've had some that have been, 18 years apart?
So it's not non-conforming.
No, and our comprehensive plan was from 2014, so.
It's pretty updated.
But I think at least going in and reviewing it and making sure that we all have, take a look at it. That's the idea, is to review it and make sure it still meets the needs of the community. And it's the same thing with the zoning ordinance. Number 5 is that the variance will not alter the essential character of the locality nor substantially impair property values or the public health, that should be public, typo. Public health, safety, or welfare in the vicinity. So consider what the area is like, what that impact might be, if any, and if there's going to be any impairment, is it minimal or substantial? So there might be some slight impact, but does it meet the level that would be needed to find that this would in fact substantially impair property values or public health, safety, or welfare? Number 6, economic considerations alone do not constitute practical difficulties, and a lot of emphasis in all the case law I've read is on the word alone. They either put it in quotes, or they underline it, or they italicize it, and they emphasize it. They don't actually provide a complete definition, but generally is that the basis? Is the reason why an economic consideration? The economic considerations that have been recognized in case law are things like investments or return on investment, property values, income, local economy. Those kinds of things have been considered as economic considerations. Number 7, the variance cannot be alleviated by a reasonable method other than a variance, and it is the minimum variance which alleviate the practical difficulties. And this goes back to what I talked about with criteria 3 about that reasonable use. This is the other side of it, that is there a reasonable alternative? Is there something, I think we've had a couple of petitions where we had somebody shift something so that it was just outside the setbacks. It may not have been exactly where they wanted it, but at least they were able to meet the zoning ordinance. I think we've done that in a meeting or two. Restricting in order to meet the requirements of the ordinance. So downsizing. Are there reasonable alternatives that can be done and still accomplish what is needed? Or is it not reasonable to do that? And then is what is being requested the smallest variance from the requirements necessary? So can or should it be reduced and still be reasonable? I think where that's come up before is minimizing the area of prime soils or agriculture, so fields. If somebody wants to build a new dwelling, how much of the agricultural area are they actually encroaching on? The less it is, the more the minimum variance criteria is more likely to be met.
So one example of that might be, and sometimes that's seen where somebody might be taking some prime soil out for a house in one location, but if they were to put it in a location where less prime soil would come out, the road would take up more prime soil than the original location. So those are some of the factors that get weighed in the discussions.
And then the last finding for a variance is that the request is not a use variance and shall not have the effect of allowing any use not allowed in the zoning district, or permit a lower degree of flood protection than the regulatory flood protection elevation, or permit standards lower than those required by state law. Basically, this just says we can't be less restrictive than state law. So if somebody wants something that's not allowed by state law, we can't do that. A use variance, which I said we would talk about, is something that would alter the essential character by allowing a use that is otherwise permitted, but non-conforming uses can continue and are not considered a use. They're considered an allowed use because nonconformities are allowed to continue, if that makes sense. It took a lot of case law to summarize that one down. But in general, nonconforming uses are are uses that are allowed. So, on to CUP, IUP criteria.
So, history, how many variance requests have we had over the last year, 2 years?
Did you say 12?
Yeah.
12 last year?
Yep.
And what's the track record?
At least one was denied.
I think last year they were all approved.
There was one that was denied.
There was one that was withdrawn. Didn't get to a denial, but looking at it, I believe, yeah, there was 12 variances, and I believe they were all approved.
I think there was one that was.
There was one at least within the last year or two that was denied. So we have had ones where they did not make the findings. Right, but I remember checking the denial box for signing by the chair. So I do know that at least one recently has been denied. The findings of fact relating to a CUP, IUP, these are the general factors. There are, depending on, there's a couple other sections that add some additional criteria. These are just the general ones we see most often. And I'm going to speed up just a little bit and kind of go through these. But no excessive burden on existing facilities and utilities. So A, is there going to be a burden? And if so, is that going to be minimal or excessive? The use is sufficiently compatible or separated by distance or screening so that the adjacent properties will not be depreciated in value and no deterrence to development of vacant land. So is it compatible with the adjacent properties? If not, is it going to be separated by distance or screening? And if either of those are true, will there be property value depreciation or deterrence? That's the way to analyze based on the facts. The structure and site have an appearance that will not have an adverse effect on adjacent residential properties. So what effect will there be, and is that going to be adverse? These ones are pretty straightforward. We already talked about those with Board of Adjustment to some extent. Reasonably related to the overall needs of the county and existing land use, consistent with the purpose of the zoning ordinance in the district in which it would be located, and in conformance with the comprehensive plan. Pretty much the same thing as the Board of Adjustment has to find. The same rules kind of apply there. And then the last fun one is, will not cause traffic hazard or congestion. So what impact will there be on traffic, if any? And is it going to be congestion or hazardous to anybody else? So it's fairly straightforward with these, just applying the information in front of you to the criteria and coming up with a decision. The difference with CUPs and IUPs is that not all criteria have to be met in order to approve a CUP, IUP, but you need to make a record of why you're approving or recommending approval anyway, or why you're not recommending denial anyway, if everything's not one way or the other. So why is one thing given more weight than another? Why are you recommending, got all that. All right, invalid bases for making findings, whether you're on the Board of Adjustment, Planning Commission, or County Board. Well, what they're proposing is better than what's there now. Still needs to meet all the legal criteria, so apply your information to the criteria. The property's vacant, so this will be an improvement. You can't keep a landowner from using his or her land. The proposal is going to bring in more money to the city or county. The owner can't sell or lease it with the present zoning, and a lot of these are, if this is the only reason why, I mean, it might be something you're considering. You still need to apply the information and the facts to the criteria. They can get more money for it if it gets rezoned, and neighbors don't like it. Those are not reasons why you should be making decisions. You should be making decisions because the facts before you meet or don't meet the criteria before you.
How about if the neighbors don't like it, but the reason for them not liking it are valid?
That's fine then. If there's a legitimate reason why the information says you should reject it, you can go ahead. But just, well, I just don't think this is a good idea, or I really don't like the idea of this and I think you should reject it, with no factual information or nothing to support that, that's what that's getting to. It's just, I don't like it is not a good reason. All right, so then once you've determined whether criteria are met, you can have conditions as well. Your conditions, any conditions that you attach to a variance or a permit need to directly relate to problems or concerns with meeting the criteria. They need to have some kind of a nexus in order to protect the public interest. So, for instance, the traffic hazard or congestion. Say, for instance, whatever they're proposing is going to have a whole string of vehicles in and out all the time. That might create some traffic hazards or congestion. But is there a condition that you can put in place that will minimize that to a reasonable level and allow it to go forward? If so, that's the kind of condition that you want. So then you would reference that in your findings as well as this will create a whole bunch more traffic, but with this in place, this is a manageable reason and we think this criteria is met. And then you have that condition attached. Yep.
And I know getting back to this invalid basis, I should have asked you a second sooner, but a while back we had one that we approved, and the neighbor was shared a driveway. We approved it, and the next day he parked vehicles in there so the neighbor couldn't use their property. We all know who it was. Is that a valid reason?
Is that it's a shared, that they share a driveway? Or
Well,
but the neighbor doesn't want it?
Driveway, but it was a handshake driveway. And
we're not getting involved in neighbor disputes.
Yeah.
We are taking the facts. If the property owner had the right to use that driveway legally, then it's a neighbor dispute. And
I was going to say what was involved was an easement, and a lot of times I hear the misconception from public with the term easement and variance. They almost simultaneously think they're the same thing. And an easement is a private binding legal agreement between private owners, and we do not like to get involved, nor are we legally bound to get involved with them. They're strictly
shouldn't get involved.
Shouldn't get involved.
I'll tell you right
For that
now.
reason alone. But you know, some of the things that Stephanie was talking about, just because a conditional use permit is a allowable use in that district, and the main, I think a lot of the legal trainings I've gone to, they always wanted to stress that is there conditions that can mitigate those concerns, because if they are reasonable conditions, it should be granted. That's what a lot of the legal analysis boils the discussion down. Is there reasonable conditions that can be placed to mitigate the concerns by neighbors or whatnot? And I think that was the one main point I wanted to emphasize too.
And good practice in all of this is going to be to reference your conditions in your findings. So if you're making a finding, note which conditions. Although there's concern about X, where the adherence to condition 5 is going to minimize the negative impacts to a reasonable level. I don't know that we do that as much as we necessarily should. I think that's one of those things we're going to start focusing on with the draft findings and trying to put that in place. All right, discussion. The top 3 don'ts for discussion. Don't act on incomplete information. If important and reasonable information is missing, table it to the next meeting. It's better than making an uninformed decision. Don't have your mind made up beforehand. This is one of those things that is crucial. Your job as a quasi-judicial member of one of these panels is to take all of the information that you're given, and that's up until and including your discussion, all of that information, and once you have that, make your decision, not beforehand. Making it beforehand will get it kicked back. So, the decision has to be made based on the record, and we're going to ask all of you to set aside any personal thoughts, opinions, etc. Look at the record, apply it to the law, and do your jobs just like any judge, just like any juror, because that's essentially what you are in a quasi-judicial role, is applying the facts to the law as a fact finder. So don't have your mind made up beforehand. And don't be afraid to disagree. I know some of you have no problem with this. Some are a little more timid than others. Don't be afraid to disagree respectfully. Respectful disagreements can ensure decisions are in the community's best interests. The reason why a lot of you have been appointed is because we want broad viewpoints. That's why we have these citizen groups, is everybody's got different points of view. Everybody's got different experiences that they bring to the table, and you can take advantage of that and learn from each other. So consider what your other board members are saying. Take the information they're providing. Consider your positions, and then at the end you vote your conscience on whether or not things have been met or not met. And that leads us to decision. When a decision, after, adequate discussion has been made, there should be a motion to, and our motions are, I will always clarify the motions if they're not clear enough for the record. I think many of you have heard me do that. But you want to be very specific about what you want to do. If you want to address the whole draft, whatever in your hand, even if we've revised it, your motion should include adopting the findings of fact as either presented or revised, depending on what we've done that night, and approving or denying the variance, conditional use permit, interim use permit, or recommending that the board do so, depending on your role, and with the conditions as presented or revised. That will encompass the whole thing all in one fell swoop. The motion will then require a second, and if any of those three components are missing, I will clarify your motion for the record to make sure it hits all of those points, because I know that's generally the way we do things. Every once in a while we don't. Sometimes the group wants to address just the findings or just the outcome, things like that, and we can do that. But at the end, all of those things need to happen, whether it's in one fell swoop or three. Then you can still have discussion on the motion. A lot of times the majority of the discussion has already taken place, but you can still have that discussion. Still applying your facts in the record to the applicable criteria and conditions. This is what you should be. Taking all your information and reaching your conclusion at this point. If you intend to vote against the motion, make sure you're being clear about what criteria you don't believe are being met. State the facts that support your position. Why do you think those factors weigh against whatever the motion was for? Make sure that your position's clear if it's not consistent with what's being proposed. Even if it is what's being proposed, you should probably still make it clear, because that's important for the record. And then when there's a vote, the chair should state or restate the motion. And then, all those in favor say aye. I prefer it. All those opposed say nay. It's clearer for the audio record, and sometimes people are a little slow, and so they might say A after you've already asked for the nays. So makes things a little bit clearer. But
so Stephanie, are you saying each member of these boards should state
that? They don't have to, but if there's differing opinions out there, make sure it's out there, not just in your head. If you're relying on information that's not out there, talk about it. Make sure that everything that you're basing your decision on is being discussed if it's something other than what's out there. If it's not out there, if you're going to say, if the motion is I move to have chocolate ice cream, and there's a second, and you don't want chocolate, you want vanilla, but you don't say that, but you suddenly vote against it, the record's going to wonder why. So, say, I'm opposed to chocolate because I think we should have vanilla, so I'm going to vote no. Yes.
What happens if a member of the planning commission misvotes? Do they have the
misvotes
ability to ask for a revote?
Like, oh no, I meant to vote yes.
This did happen.
I think we can probably find a way to make things clearer if need be, that they misunderstood, something like that. But that's why it's so important for the chair to restate the motion before voting, is so that you're clear on what you're voting on.
I did.
In that case, if it suddenly screws up, they're like, wait, the motion went the wrong way, I messed this up. We make the motion again and do it over.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. But the important piece for this is that your decision should reflect your board's judgment, applying the information to the law, and not just will. Those are two different things. Your judgment, not your will.
But for the record, you have to rescind that motion.
No, because it's already been voted on. It just failed. Or passed and shouldn't have. Then we'll figure it out as we go. We might have to pull up some Robert's rules on the internet, figure out how to make that work. But if we need to correct something, we can generally find a way to correct something. All right, so we got 10 minutes left.
And I'd like a minute at the end.
Okay,
We have 9 minutes.
I've got 3 slides, it looks like. So let's talk about judicial review and why all of this is so important, why we make you guys do this once a year or thereabouts, is because we're preparing for judicial review. Judicial review is based on the record and findings. Without a record and findings, a decision usually does not stand. If the court looks at it and goes, we don't know why they did this, it gets not just kicked back, but granted, because they think that you just didn't do your jobs. Anyone that is aggrieved can appeal. It's not just the applicant, whether it's an approval or a denial. The applicant can appeal. Anybody else that is aggrieved by the decision can appeal. And what courts consider is whether or not the law is clear as to what's required or expected. Do the findings represent the information in the record? So you can make all the findings you want, but if they're not reflective of the information before you, they're not going to stand. And is there a reasonable connection between the record, the findings, the ordinance, and the decision? So does it make sense is kind of the general gist there.
So Stephanie, if there's an appeal, is the county attorney's office involved in this, or is it totally out of the county's hands? It's in the court.
It gets referred to MCIT. There's a couple things they don't take, right?
Yeah, it's usually referred to, we always have to contact MCIT when there's an appeal brought, and usually they will provide counsel. And that's been, I can't think of a instance where that's not happened.
So they would appoint an attorney?
They appoint an attorney, but there are certain areas that they may not cover, but we discuss that with them, so.
The Board of Adjustments Chair reads a statement at the end of every decision about the pathway so that any aggrieved person knows what to do next.
All right, so then if it's a legislative decision, such as an ordinance amendment, the challenger has to show there is no rational basis supporting the decision. This is going to be your most deferential to the decision. So whatever the decision is assumed to be correct, unless there's no rational basis as shown by the challenger, which is a little bit different standard than a quasi-judicial decision, such as for a variance or a CUP, IUP, where on a challenge for this, it's based on legal sufficiency and the factual basis for each decision, whether that decision is reasonable rather than arbitrary and capricious in light of the applicable ordinance. And if there is a lack of adequate findings, it is presumed arbitrary and capricious. The burden is on the decision maker, the Board of Adjustment, the Planning Commission / County Board, to show legally sufficient reasons. And if they don't, then there's a stricter standard of review, meaning there has to be substantial evidence in the record to support the decision if you don't have adequate findings. There is an exception where they're clarifying law or stating new rules, and that in those circumstances, instead of just granting whatever the challenger is saying, then they kick it back to your deciding body for new findings based on the law they have just clarified and given to you. So with that, any questions about the legal stuff before I give it back to Kay, since I just talked for way longer than I thought I was going to?
All right, well, thank yous on the screen, but I wanted to say, and this dovetails perfectly with what Stephanie just said, we do this training at a minimum of once a year, and we break it up. Last year we had Jay Squires from the state organization, or from, from his own law firm. And a lot of the new folks received a memo on land use that was written by him. Mark Clark suffered through the grainy production of his presentation last year, but that's also available for anybody that would like to watch it. You might fast forward through the parts that are a little indistinguishable because he was moving around a lot. But also there are some training opportunities, land use education opportunities that come forward periodically. And Kelly made a good point last year when I put one of them out there and said, I don't have any budget for this, but if anybody wants to go, I'll set it up. And she said, respectfully, if you could find some budget, I think you might get more takers. And so, training, information, land use decision making, these do come up, and we will make sure to let you know. And the costs are pretty reasonable, and I think Kelly's points were well taken. That if it's something that a few people want to go to, we'll find some other way to. Scrimp and not, to make sure that there are opportunities that you can attend if you would like to. I know it's a long time to sit here. We really appreciate your time and energy. And as volunteers, it's such a valuable function that you serve with the county. So on behalf of the Planning and Environmental Services staff, and I know, Karen, you feel the same, thank you very much.